Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The first item of business is time for reflection, and our time for reflection leader today is Ruth Donaldson, Church Relationships Team Leader UK, CSW.
Presiding Officer and members of the Scottish Parliament, thank you for the opportunity to address and reflect with you this afternoon. What would it be like to live in a world where everyone is free to believe? How might Scotland reflect this? CSW strives for a world where everyone is free to adopt a religion or belief of their choice, free from harassment, free from oppression, and free from persecution. We stand for freedom of religion or belief for all, also known as FORB. Whether you have faith or none at all, it safeguards diversity, democracy, development, rule of law, stability and prosperity. Furthermore, FORB is good for social cohesion and business. In what Christians call the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, the advice through the prophet Jeremiah is a surprising one. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Even in a foreign land, the prophet Jeremiah exhorts the exiled Israelites to build homes, plant gardens, and pray for the city's welfare. This passage offers a profound insight into the importance of seeking peace and prosperity for the broader society. It underscores a foundational Christian principle. The flourishing of a community is intertwined with the freedom and well-being of all its members. When people are free to practice their religion or belief, they contribute to the common good, fostering a society that thrives on mutual respect and cooperation. In the New Testament, the parable of the Good Samaritan, told by Jesus, demonstrates the moral imperatives that arise from true religious freedom. A man, robbed, beaten, left for dead on the road, was ignored by his own community that we think should have helped him. But it was a Samaritan, someone who would have been considered the other, who stopped to offer compassion and care. The Samaritan exemplifies the essence of loving one's neighbour and not just one's own community. This parable teaches that genuine compassion transcends cultural and religious boundaries. Forb encourages an environment where such compassion can flourish. It allows individuals to act accordingly to their deeply held moral convictions, fostering a society where acts of kindness and solidarity are common. We have recently seen the consequences when the other is feared or blamed. It can result in violence, oppression, and fear. Christian theology therefore highlights the intrinsic value of Forb as a means of promoting peace, resilience, and compassion. By upholding this freedom, we not only honour the dignity of each person, but also create a society where diverse beliefs can coexist harmoniously, contributing to the collective welfare. Let us therefore commit to promoting and protecting this freedom, recognising it is a cornerstone of a just and thriving society. Thank you.
Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 14246 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to business. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press their request to speak button now. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 14246 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is topical questions, and at question number 1, I call Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the potential impact on the cultural sector and livelihoods of the reported closure of Creative Scotland's Open Fund for individuals due to budgetary constraints.
Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson.
Thank you, and with your permission, Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin by mentioning today's memorial service for Ewan MacDonald, who died recently from motor neuron disease. Ewan lived for 20 years with MND. He established the Ewan MacDonald Centre for Motor Neuron Disease Research in partnership with the University of Edinburgh, the Voice Bank study which enables people who are at risk of losing their voice through illness to preserve it, and Ewan's Guide with his sister Kiki, which is used by disabled people to review, share and discover accessible places to visit. He was inspiration, and I'm sure the whole Chamber extends its condolences to his family today. In answer to Mr Stewart's topical question, I am well aware of the potential impact of decisions by Creative Scotland on the Open Fund for individuals. I'd like to extend my thanks to the many people in the culture and arts sector in particular who have been in touch to underscore how important the fund is, and I'd also like to give them and members of the Scottish Parliament the assurance that I'm working extremely hard with colleagues across government to make sure that the appropriate funding decisions are made to sustain and support the culture and arts sector. Announcements are set to follow on the pre-budget fiscal update, and the Government remains committed to increasing financial support to culture and the arts.
Alexander Stewart.
Can I associate myself and my party with the comments by the Cabinet Secretary regarding Ewan MacDonald? I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. More than 170 artists have warned in an open letter that culture catastrophe is in progress and job losses in the sector are already taking place. The situation is dire, and it is clear that urgent and substantial action is required and needed. How do you justify abandoning a sector which sustains over 80,000 jobs and contributes more than £5 billion to the economy? And can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he has yet met with Creative Scotland or other organisations to listen to the concerns they have expressed?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the concerns have been raised by the creative sector rather than Creative Scotland itself, but I'm content to meet with any members of the culture or the arts sector, many of whom have written to me about this very issue. I have to say it is disappointing that Creative Scotland took the decision that it did in relation to the Open Fund before the Scottish Government, as is normal practice, could complete due diligence to release funding. The Scottish Government continues to provide significant funding to Creative Scotland each year, and it will continue to do so. Members will recognise my commitment, oft stated in this chamber, to increasing funding for the culture and arts sector, and I look forward to updating colleagues on that shortly.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary. It's hard to believe that only 11 months ago, the SNP conference, the then First Minister, announced a huge vote of confidence in the future of the cultural sector. Yet, despite the recent success of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, the announcement of the closure of the Creative Scotland's Open Fund for individuals is nothing short of a betrayal for these artists and cultural workers who have made that such success possible. Cabinet Secretary, how will you entrust and rebuild trust in a sector that has been consistently let down?
Always through the chair, please. Cabinet Secretary.
Indeed. Well, firstly, can I make the point again that I and the Government is committed to increasing funding for culture. And I think he is aware that that stands in contrast to the outgoing UK Conservative Government and the incoming Labour Government cutting culture funding through the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, indeed also cutting culture in Wales by the Welsh Government. I remain committed to securing additional funding for the culture and arts sector because we acknowledge how important it is, and it would be welcome if colleagues from other parties would do everything that they can to join the cultural and arts community. Myself and colleagues in government are doing everything that we can to get the appropriate funding in place as quickly as possible to make sure that not only is the sector safeguarded and sustained, but can thrive in the future.
Thank you. We have much interest, so concise questions and responses appreciated. I call Emma Roddick.
Presiding Officer, I've had recent discussions with Eden Court in Inverness, amongst others, about the concern they have about supporting local Highlands and Islands artists without the Open Fund. Could the Cabinet Secretary speak to what support is available to such people, particularly given they've lost opportunities through Brexit?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, one of the particular projects that I'm very supportive of is the Culture Collective, which does a lot of good work in the north of Scotland and is supported through funding from the Scottish Government. I'm committed to that, but I'm also committed more generally to making sure that art funds, including the Open Fund, are open for artists to make sure that the cultural sector can thrive. I can give my colleague the assurance that everything is being done in government at the present time to make sure that the funding is safeguarded and is provided as a priority. It's something that I was committed to over a year ago. I remain committed to doing so now and into the future.
Neil Bibby.
I associate myself with the remarks by the Cabinet Secretary about the late Ewan MacDonald. This is a total mess, and Scotland's artists are paying the price for this government's incompetence and poor planning. Angus Robertson talks about the commitments he has given. He gave a gold-plated commitment to the sector to replenish £6.6 million to Creative Scotland, but this funding has yet to transpire. The Open Fund is closed, and as we've heard, the overall lack of certainty has led to some of Scotland's biggest names, including Paolo Nutini and Biffy Clyro, to warn of an impending cultural catastrophe. Given the constant cycle of promises followed by cuts, how can Scotland's arts and culture sector have confidence in their future and anything this Cabinet Secretary says now?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'll take absolutely no lessons on austerity from the Labour Party when it comes to funding anything. His party in government in the United Kingdom is cutting funding for culture and the arts. This is a fact. This government is increasing funding. I remain committed to doing so, and I hope that he will welcome the good news to come.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. After previous uncertainty, the Cabinet Secretary confirmed in an answer to me in November 2023 that the Scottish Government were committed to providing the £6.6 million shortfall funding to Creative Scotland for 24-25. In my response, I described it as a U-turn on a U-turn on a U-turn, and it appears that we have another U-turn, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, can I make a plea to you to be fair, to be transparent and to be open with Scotland's culture and creative sector, because at the moment it's a hokey-cokey?
We'll remind members again to always speak speak through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, just very briefly, I hope there is universal understanding across the Chamber that Creative Scotland is an arm's-length organisation that makes decisions. It's not for government ministers to dispense largesse to parts of the cultural sector that they particularly support. I do agree that it's important that the funding is in place to make sure that culture can be sustained, safeguarded and thrive. I remain committed to that. I'm continuing to argue for that in government, and I have to say my colleagues are very supportive of that, and I hope to be able to update colleagues on that in the near future.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the short term, it's essential that the Cabinet Secretary finds a solution to the closure of the Open Fund, which is causing great concern to all of our constituents. In the longer term, though, I want to come with positive solutions. We've already persuaded Parliament to pass legislation to give councils the power for a visitor levy. We're now making the case for a stadium levy on large, profitable events, again a way of raising revenue to fund culture and the arts. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that empowering local government to raise revenue from those who do make significant profits is the most effective way that we can find to solve this problem and generate the funds that are needed?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm sure the Presiding Officer would wish me to focus my reply in relationship to the Open Fund that I know the member is very committed to, but he is right to point out that there are other potential income sources. The visitor levy will play an important part of that, and if he has specific suggestions, I am open to hearing them from him and his colleagues.
Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I met last month with the Executive Director of Edinburgh's International Festival. Whilst Edinburgh's International Festival is in large part the jewel in the crown of Scotland's cultural offering, its survival is not inevitable, and its Executive Director, Francesca Heggie, reminded me that actually a lot of that work is sustained by the smaller arts groups who are funded through the Open Fund. Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise that the 3 million visitors who come to Edinburgh for our festivals don't just stay in Edinburgh, they visit all parts of Scotland? It's vital for our economy. So investing in the arts is actually an investment in our economy.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the point of festivals is very well made, and it's not just the tremendous festivals that we have in Edinburgh. We have tremendous festivals in Scotland with Celtic connections and right the length and breadth of Scotland, and that's why the Government, at the time of the festivals, announced a strategic partnership with our festivals across the country to make sure that they can thrive in future. I remain focused absolutely on making sure that the appropriate funding is in place, that Creative Scotland have the funds that it requires to do the job that it needs to do, and the support and assistance from members across the Chamber and the great many people in the arts and culture community who have been in touch in recent weeks to underscore the importance of the Open Fund are extremely persuasive, and I'm doing everything that I can in government to make sure that the appropriate funding is in place.
Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I note with great interest the comments from the Cabinet Secretary and await with optimism updates in the coming days. However, given this, does he agree with me that perhaps in a certain extent this situation has arisen because of a wider financial picture, in that the Scottish Government is waiting with great interest for the UK Government's final budget at the end of October and really won't have its own funding tied down into February 2025? To what extent has that played a part?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the points that Michelle Thompson makes are well made about the challenges, particularly for colleagues who are having to deal in the first instance with budgetary considerations across the Scottish Government. What I know as the Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for culture is that this Government has given a commitment not just to protect culture funding but to increase it, and I remain committed to that, as does the Government, and I look forward to updating colleagues on that in the near future.
Thank you. Question number 2, Willie Rennie.
To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of its work to tackle the poverty-related educational attainment gap in light of the gap reportedly widening across all school qualifications in the recent exam results.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
The most recent set of results from Scotland's schools show that for National 5 and higher, the attainment gap has returned to levels broadly comparable with those in 2019, the last comparable year on record due to changes made during the pandemic to qualifications requirements. The results also show record levels of young people achieving technical and vocational qualifications, with an almost 25% increase on the year prior. And there has been an increase in students from the most disadvantaged communities gaining a place in higher education, with a 12% increase this year alone. Notwithstanding, it is clear that the pandemic is continuing to have a lasting impact on our children and young people here and elsewhere in the UK. Responding to this year's results, I convened a meeting with Directors of Education to focus on improvement and local variation, along with the Chief Examiner and Interim Chief Inspector. It is imperative that government work to drive improvement in our schools post-pandemic, and to that end, I will set out further detail pertaining to the government's response in the coming weeks in relation to qualification reform and school improvement.
Willie Rennie.
The Education Secretary chooses her milestones very carefully. She knows that this government will be measured on its promise made in 2016 to close the poverty-related attainment gap. So 8 years into that promise, how confident is she that that promise will be delivered by 2026?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Rennie for his question. I think it is worthwhile pointing out the progress that has been made thus far in relation to closing the gap. I don't take away from some of the challenge, and of course some of that challenge is not of this government's making. But we have seen a narrowing of the gap in primary 7, for example, in literacy and numeracy in December statistics. We've also seen, though, progress in relation to our young people going on to positive destinations since 2009. The attainment gap has narrowed by 60% in that regard. And again, as I intimated in my initial response, we've seen really strong progress this year in terms of widening access, with a 12% increase in university acceptance for those from our poorest communities. I don't take away from the ongoing challenge here, but I do hope that Mr Rennie can recognise that progress. And of course, I would say that the financial context within which the government is operating is also relevant here, because if we continue to see an austerity agenda being pursued by the Westminster government, irrespective of party, that is going to hamper the progress I am able to make as Education Secretary, because I will have less money at my disposal to make the necessary progress we need to see in closing the gap.
Willie Rennie.
It does seem that the SNP government are focused more on finding excuses than they are on closing the poverty-related attainment gap. She's also incredibly selective with her statistics, and I know we all like to choose our own statistics, but she is going to be measured on the poverty-related attainment gap as set out by the former First Minister in 2016. So what does the Education Secretary say to those thousands of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who the promise was made to them but has failed to be delivered so far?
Cabinet Secretary.
For his question, he talks about selective use of statistics, and of course when I was teaching modern studies we used to talk about being selective in your use of facts. So in my initial response to Mr Rennie, I talked about National 5 and higher. And Mr Rennie might want to look at the results this year for Advanced Higher, where we have seen a slight widening of the gap. Why is that the case in relation to that qualification? Because we've seen an increase in relation to the number of students sitting that qualification. I think that's a good thing, because in the past, certainly when I was at school back in Mr Rennie's constituency some time ago now, there was gatekeeping in relation to that qualification. So it used to be in the past that children were essentially told they weren't bright enough to sit that qualification. I don't think that was right, and I think we've now seen a far broader approach to qualification entry, and undoubtedly that will impact in relation to attainment. But we have seen progress in relation to closing the gap. I rehearsed some of the narrative there in relation to our performance at primary 7 level, and of course in terms of positive destinations. But the final point I would make is this, Presiding Officer. Scotland is not an outlier in relation to closing the poverty-related attainment gap. For both A-levels and GCSEs this year, the gap between the highest and the lowest performing regions in England has grown and remains higher than it was before the pandemic. I'm not using this as an excuse to Mr Rennie's point. What I would say is that context in Scotland is felt all over the UK, and the cohort of young people in front of teachers right now have lived through a global pandemic, and we should all be mindful about what that means in relation to their outcomes as a result.
I'm keen to have more members, for more members to have an opportunity to put questions, concise questions and responses appreciated. Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, 8 years since the promise was made, is the Cabinet Secretary in a position to provide us with a credible written strategic plan that she's working to close the poverty-related attainment gap, or is she making it up as she goes along?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think, as Mr Kerr is well aware, this government plan is the Scottish Attainment Challenge, which has over £1 billion of funding coming to closing the poverty-related attainment gap during this parliamentary session. Well, Mr Kerr doesn't think that's a good idea. I think it's a pretty substantive plan. He should engage with the detail of it if he's interested. However, if he also listened to my initial response, and I hope he was, I stated very clearly that I will give a written and a fulsome update in relation to qualification reform in the coming weeks, and that will set out a clear trajectory in relation to improvement.
Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Central to the poverty-related attainment gap is clearly the issue of poverty itself, with thousands of children being pushed into poverty by the austerity agenda, which the Liberal Democrats were central to ushering in. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that one of the most important things that we can do in improving educational attainment is to eradicate child poverty?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the member makes a hugely important point. Of course, what drives the attainment gap is poverty caused by more than a decade of austerity and brutal cuts, supported by both Labour and the Tories. So children and families are bearing the brunt of Tory cuts to social security and brutal policies like the two-child limit, which of course we now know is supported by Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. We know too, Presiding Officer, that modelling published estimates that Scottish Government policies will keep 100,000 children out of relative poverty in 24-25, with relative poverty levels 10 percentage points lower than they would have otherwise been. But meanwhile, the Tories and Labour are committed to doubling down on austerity, and that impacts on attainment and poverty.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary said at the weekend she can't raise attainment with fewer teachers, yet teacher numbers will this year be cut. Later this afternoon, it's likely we'll hear of further pressures to local government and school budgets. Far from reforming anything in education, the Cabinet Secretary is putting forward an education bill that essentially achieves very little. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, fewer teachers, fewer resources and what's been dubbed as pretty meaningless reform, is this really the plan to raise attainment and close the poverty-related attainment gap?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank Ms Duncan-Glancy for her question, and of course I'm sure she will recognise there was actually an increase in secondary teachers last year. I'm sure she would want to record that fact. And of course in Scotland we have the lowest pupil-teacher ratio, far lower, for example, than in Labour-run Wales. I'm sure the member would also like to recognise that. And of course I'm sure she would like to recognise that we spend more per pupil in Scotland than any other part of the UK. I'm sure she would also like to recognise that. And of course I'm sure Ms Duncan-Glancy would love to recognise that Scottish teachers are the best paid in the UK because of investment from this government. Now, the member talks about reform, and I look forward to engaging with her in that process to better improve the outcomes for Scotland's children and young people, but I very much hope that she can recognise the inputs from this government in supporting our education system.
And Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What assessment has the Cabinet Secretary made in respect to attainment on the impact of the increasing levels of violence and threat being reported in classrooms on the teaching and learning environment, and what will she do about it?
I thank the member for his question. Of course, I know he takes a keen interest in this matter, and I hope he will be attending my statement on the Behaviour Action Plan, which I will give to Parliament later. Today, he will be aware that we published the Action Plan 2 weeks ago now, and that Action Plan responds to the assessment the Government undertook on the impact of behaviour in relation to attainment. That was published in the Behaviour in Scotland Schools research towards the end of last year. So I'd encourage him to engage with that data if he hasn't already done so, and I look forward to engaging with him further in the statement later today.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on community cohesion. The First Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. First Minister.
So during the summer recess, everyone was affected by the dreadful tragic deaths of 3 girls in Southport. On the 29th of July, Baby King, aged 6, Elsie Dot Stancombe, aged 7, and Alice De Silva Agia, aged 9, who were all attending a summer dance class, were attacked and killed. My heart goes out to the families of the girls who lost their lives. No parent should have to face the loss of a child, let alone in such appalling circumstances. 10 others were seriously injured in this horrific and shocking attack. My thoughts have been with the community of Southport who, whilst facing this unthinkable tragedy, then faced further distress. Starting in Southport and sparked by false information and rumour on social media as to the identity and background of the perpetrator of the attack, communities in England and Northern Ireland were then made to endure disorder and rioting on top of their grief and concern for those affected. This led to considerable distress to residents, significant damage caused to businesses and a number of casualties, including police officers who were injured in the line of duty. Presiding Officer, let me be clear, this activity was not and should not be classed as protest. This was violence and thuggery, pure and simple, perpetrated by those with a far-right ideology, by those who have been taken in by that rhetoric and by criminals. Far from having legitimate concerns, Those indulging in these mindless acts were doing so from a place of racism, Islamophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. This cannot and should not be tolerated anywhere. It is absolutely unacceptable for anyone to live in fear of leaving their home, or to feel nervous about sending their children to school, or to be afraid to use certain services or transport. Justice has been done in the English courts, with sentences reflecting the serious criminality perpetrated. To date, Scotland has not had to deal with incidents of a similar nature, despite the attempts to organise these via social media. But we must continue to be vigilant against ideologies that can lead to such violence. We cannot take the view that we may be immune from related disorder occurring on our own doorsteps. Were we to see anything similar in Scotland, our courts have robust sentencing powers available to them to use as they see fit. And the Justice Secretary and I have been in regular contact with Police Scotland, who remain alert to the prospect of disorder and are working with their colleagues in other parts of the United Kingdom to ensure that they can respond accordingly and immediately if such response is required. I am grateful to the Chief Constable and want to thank her and all in Police Scotland for their continued work and commitment in keeping our communities safe. Presiding Officer, we should rightly be proud of our history as a nation that values both free speech and welcoming those who want to live and work here. We can be proud that as a society we celebrate, value and protect diversity in our communities. But we must challenge those who would deny those values. We must guard against prejudice, discrimination and misinformation that aim to incite hatred and violence. And we must remember that those who seek to divide us are in the very small minority, and let me be clear, it is a small minority. Whilst we watched the violence unfold in communities and heard about how social media was being used to whip up the disorder and violence that several towns witnessed overnights in August, we also saw many more people in communities come together to express how this was not reflective of their towns. We saw many more people work together to clean up the mess and damage in their neighbourhoods. And we can all take heart that on the 10th of August, thousands of people took to the streets across the UK to protest against the racist thuggery and anti-immigrant rhetoric that they had witnessed. Far, far more people than had taken part in the disorder itself. Presiding Officer, our relationships with our diverse communities are crucial to community cohesion. And I know that many people felt scared or uneasy in those early days of August. Violence, prejudice, racism, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have no place in our society, and nobody should ever be subjected to them. So I want to reassure everyone impacted that this government will always work to ensure every person living in Scotland is protected, and that we are united in our opposition to anyone who would seek to use disorder as a means of division. In the first week of August, I attended the Edinburgh Central Mosque, and at my invitation, faith leaders came together as well. This provided an opportunity for us all to make clear that conflict and hatred have no place here. Faith leaders from across Scotland continue to promote mutual respect and share a common desire for everybody to be safe within our society. And as First Minister, I assured them that desire is shared by all of Scotland's political leaders. Presiding Officer, I also convened a meeting and briefing between political leaders and Police Scotland, and I thank colleagues in this chamber for taking the time to attend that event. This enabled senior office bearers to brief all of us on the work they are undertaking to keep people safe as they engage with communities to provide reassurance and ensure that none feel marginalised, isolated or vulnerable. In recent weeks, the service has had considerable engagement with Muslim and other minority communities. Greater officer visibility around mosques and hotels housing asylum seekers have also been well received. Let me be absolutely clear to anyone in Scotland considering mimicking the kind of vile behaviour we have witnessed in parts of England and Northern Ireland this summer, that their actions will not be tolerated, they will be dealt with robustly, and criminal actions online will be taken just as seriously. I want to reassure people in Scotland that we have plans and preparations in place to ensure that everybody is kept safe in this period, and that we continue to work cooperatively with our wide range of organisations throughout the country to tackle racism, hatred and to promote inclusion. Presiding Officer, let me turn now to the role of social media and how its use, or should I say misuse, has proven how easy it is for false information to spread. Following the tragic events in Southport, social media was a key factor in the first incident of disorder which then took place. In Scotland, we had an occasion where untrue speculation was spread about the perpetrator of an incident in Stirling. I wish to commend Police Scotland for their swift action in countering this misinformation, and I believe in helping to reduce the risk of any possible conflict in Scotland. While we all have an individual duty to question whether everything we read online is actually true, it is very clear to me that the major organisations behind these platforms also have a duty both moral and legal, to take action to ensure that individuals in our society are not subjected to hate and threatening behaviour, and that communities are protected from violence. I wrote to the main social media companies asking them to promptly outline the decisive steps they plan to take on this matter, and we have engaged constructively with the United Kingdom Government on this question. Social media companies have assured me that safety teams have been working to detect any associated violation of their terms of service, and that they have taken action which includes account suspension and content removal. But recent events suggest that there is much more work to do to ensure hateful content and misinformation do not proliferate. Presiding Officer, I want to conclude by emphasising to anyone who feels fearful of being targeted for who they are or what they believe that we stand in solidarity with them. Scotland is a diverse, multicultural society where everyone is welcome, and I want us to be united in our opposition to anyone who would seek to use disorder and violence to divide people. However, we are not immune to the actions of a violent, misguided minority, and therefore we must remain vigilant. People in Scotland who are feeling afraid, marginalised or isolated as the result of this summer's events should rightly look to their parliamentarians to stand with them, and we do. As First Minister of Scotland, I will always be emphatic that violence and conflict have no place in our communities. The Scottish Government is committed to building cohesive communities within which divisive narratives will not resonate. It is in our power to address hatred and prejudice by tackling its root causes. The most powerful and effective way to do this is by bringing communities together to learn from one another. Standing for tolerance and equality and against hate and violence is for all of us in this chamber and across society to commit to. The importance of one Scotland, where people live in safety and peace and have the opportunity to flourish, cannot be understated. I would like to close by reflecting on the words of Sabir Zazi, Chief Executive of the Scottish Refugee Council, who was among community leaders that I met in August. Sabir emphasised the importance of nourishing community togetherness, of shared values and of the need to build bridges and bonds between communities. Presiding Officer, let us all affirm our commitment to doing just that. Bridges must be built, but they must also be maintained, and that is the approach that we should all take.
The First Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business, and I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by saying how good it is to see Richard Lockhead back in Parliament today after his serious illness. People across Murray and obviously here in the Chamber are pleased to see him looking so well, and our thoughts are with Richard, Fiona, Angus and Fraser as he continues his recovery. Turning to the statement we've just heard, I want to echo the comments of the First Minister about the tragedy in Southport. Every parent worries about their child getting hurt, and no one can imagine the pain the families are going through right now of 3 precious girls who were brutally murdered in horrific circumstances at a summer dance class. It is unimaginable. And our thoughts and prayers are with the family and friends of the young victims and indeed the others injured during this senseless attack. I also want to say at this point unequivocally that everyone, regardless of faith, race and background, here in Scotland and across the UK, deserves to feel safe. Violence has no place in our society. The rioting and attacks that we saw in UK cities over the summer were both tragic and deeply alarming. And while it is welcome that these events have not occurred in Scotland, we can't be complacent and deceive ourselves that they could never happen here. We have to be prepared. But police officer numbers in Scotland have fallen by 1,000 in the last 3 years. David Threadgold, the chair of the Scottish Police Federation, has said, and I quote, "The service simply cannot recruit the number of officers it needs to replace those who are leaving." We all know the vital role that police officers play in managing disorder and keeping our communities safe. So what action is this government taking to halt the reduction in police officers across Scotland? And at this point, I remind the Chamber that my wife is a serving police officer. Also in June, before the riots occurred, this government released almost 500 inmates from prisons early because of a lack of capacity in prisons. So can the First Minister provide an update on prison capacity and whether more early releases are being considered by his government? And finally, the Home Secretary announced yesterday that the UK Government will review its counter-extremism strategy. What discussion has the First Minister had with the UK Government about this work?
First Minister.
Can I thank Mr Ross for his contribution and associate myself very much with his remarks in relation to my colleague Richard Lockhead, who I'm delighted to see back after very serious illness, and I commend the staff at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, who I had the great privilege to meet just days after Richard's operation, to thank them for the extraordinary work that they had undertaken. It puts me in awe of what clinicians have to face and to handle, and I'm profoundly grateful to them, and I'm delighted that Richard is back in his place today. In relation to some of Mr Ross makes a number of comments about the importance of community cohesion and the safety of children, and I associate myself entirely with him. He is entirely correct about those. On police numbers are growing as a consequence of very significant recruitment efforts that are now underway by Police Scotland, and we expect the numbers to be rising in the period ahead. What I would say is that police capacity has been adequate and appropriate to deal with the challenges that we faced, and indeed the Chief Constable has been able to take part in mutual aid to Northern Ireland, which she would only do if she was confident about police resourcing in Scotland, and she has given me that assurance that she is. In relation to the early release of prisoners, Parliament obviously authorised the steps that we have taken so far. The prison population is continuing to rise, and to rise significantly. So the Government and Cabinet was updated on that issue by the Justice Secretary this morning. So we are having to look at the issues about capacity within our prison system, and whether there are any other steps that we have to take to ensure the prison population remains safe and sustainable for prisoners and staff. And the Justice Secretary will update Parliament about these questions. In relation to the work of the United Kingdom Government on terrorism measures, obviously we keep in regular discussion with the United Kingdom Government on these questions, and we will expect to take forward those discussions in the period ahead as the UK Government forms its steps. Mr Ross will, of course, be aware that we have taken a slightly different approach to the handling of these issues in terms of their communication within Scotland in the past, which have been built on building community confidence in anti-terror measures, and I've a great deal of confidence in that, and I think most importantly the communities of Scotland have confidence in that measure, as we saw demonstrated during the course of the period of instability that we wrestled with over the summer.
Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by echoing the comments about Richard Lockhead? It's great to see him back. And can I also warmly welcome the content of the First Minister's statement today. Hearts go out to all the families in Southport, and in particular those directly impacted by those horrendous acts of violence. And tragically, when those families and that community that was hurting needed love, time and support, Instead, a hateful band of far-right thugs attempted to hijack those tragic murders of 3 young girls with the aim of further dividing our communities and spreading fear right across the country. I want to praise the response of the UK Government, which I think was strong, swift and appropriate. I also want to thank the Scottish Government and the police here in Scotland for the tone of their own response in order to minimise the risk of disorder here in Scotland. And I welcome the opportunity for us in this Parliament today to again come together and speak with one voice, that we will not allow the acts of a mindless few to speak for the vast majority in this country who believe in the principles of peace, tolerance and love. But sadly, there are those who do seek to divide our communities, and much of it amplified by reckless politicians only interested in their own divisive agendas, and we've got to call them out for what they are. But there also has to be greater responsibility on the social media companies who are allowing their platforms as vehicles to amplify, to recruit, to organise and to fundraise. There's also, of course, individual responsibility to make sure people aren't either deliberately or inadvertently sharing misinformation. We all have a responsibility to make sure we're doing everything we can to pull our country together. Because ultimately, Presiding Officer, there will always be those who want to turn community against community because they thrive on the politics of us versus them. But here in Scotland and right across the UK, we can't be complacent and must recognise our responsibility to build a society that is about all of us. So can I ask the First Minister, does he agree that we must never and will never allow the words or the actions of a mindless few far-right thugs to define who we are as a people or who we are as a nation?
First Minister.
Can I welcome Mr Salvar's remarks, and particularly the point that he makes in relation to the interaction with social media, because there is a responsibility on all of us in what we say and what we do, but also in terms of what we believe on social media. But there is a huge obligation on the companies, and I think the United Kingdom Government has been making it pretty clear to social media companies, as have Ofcom, and Ofcom's statements at the height of these difficulties were very, very clear about the obligation of social media companies to operate within the code of responsibility. And as I indicated in my statement, I think there is much, much more to be done to ensure that is the case. I don't think we can pause for a moment to, in any way, shape or form, relax our rejection of the far-right ideology. I think we have got to be persistent and assertive about setting out that that represents the wrong agenda for our country, and that we have to stand together. We believe in the importance of diverse multicultural communities. We believe in the importance of bringing people together. And all of us, and I'm very pleased, I was delighted to welcome the political leaders to Butte House to enable us to have a briefing and to make the point, which colleagues did make, that we are working to create a cohesive society. We want people to come together, and we reject the ideology of the far right in politics.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On behalf of the Scottish Greens, can I also offer a warm welcome back to Richard Lochhead. We're very pleased to see him recovering well. And can I thank the First Minister for his statement, which properly reflected both the depth of compassion for those affected by the violence in Southport, the horrific murders, but also the depth of anger at those who have opportunistically capitalised on that horrific event in order to pursue their own toxic ideology. But can I suggest that while I welcome a lot of what was in his statement, there are two things that were missing from it. Because it's not only social media that is responsible for the promotion and proliferation of hatred and prejudice against immigrants, against asylum seekers, and against Muslims. These attitudes have also been deliberately cultivated by large swathes of the mainstream media in the UK and by successive UK governments. And politicians from a number of different parties are culpable for that. And secondly, it's when social cohesion, when community cohesion is already weakened, that the far right finds its opportunity. So can I say to the First Minister and ask him if he agrees that if more austerity is coming at us, We have a responsibility to ensure that the burden of that falls on the wealthiest, not on our communities, on the investment that they need or on the public services that they need if we want a chance of maintaining the cohesion of the communities the First Minister describes.
First Minister.
Sir, I acknowledge the importance of the points that Mr Harvey makes, and I thank him for his comments. I think there have been many comments made in the mainstream media and by politicians that I would never, ever want to be associated with because they represent an ideology that I find repugnant, but I accept the reality that is there, which is why it's so important that we exercise the political leadership in Scotland, that we reject that ideology and we reject it right across this parliamentary chamber. And I think that's to the credit of all parties in this Parliament, that we are prepared to stand together to reject that. And I will do everything I can as First Minister to foster a climate that enables that to be the case, because I want this Parliament to speak as one, that far-right ideology, that any ideology of racism or hate has absolutely no place in our society whatsoever. In relation to his point about social and economic cohesion within our communities, the Government, as he will know, invests heavily to make sure that we work to tackle poverty in our society. I would like to feel I was operating in a situation where I had a more sympathetic prevailing climate to try to tackle poverty as a consequence of the change of government. I am left somewhat bewildered by the fact that we're not making more headway on that question, but it is early days. But it's important that we recognise the damage, and this is where I do associate myself with Mr Harvey. We recognise the damage of austerity. Austerity is damaging our communities and the fabric of life. That's why it's got to come to an end, and I want to ensure that is the case in Scotland.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I too welcome Richard Lochhead back to the Chamber. It's great to see him so well. Can I start by thanking the First Minister for the tone of his statement, also the inclusivity with which he approached the immediate aftermath and, well, during the riots when he invited all political leaders to Butte House, and for the briefings we got there. Presiding Officer, when those murders happened, the four nations of these islands fell silent, and that silence was broken by the brutal thuggery we saw on the streets of England. I think, astonished. I'm sure the Chamber shares my astonishment that some of the youngest perpetrators of that lawlessness were as young as 11 years old. Nobody is born racist, but as the First Minister says, that many people in our society are becoming more susceptible to rhetoric and online misinformation. And when it comes to young people of that age, it strikes me that we do, as a state, have a role to counter that. So I'd like to ask the First Minister what steps his government is taking to work with educational authorities to make sure that we counter that level of misinformation and rhetoric right at the heart of our schooling system.
First Minister.
Sir, I welcome Mr Cole-Hamilton's comments. He will be familiar with the ethos of Curriculum for Excellence, which is the curriculum in our schools, which one of its objectives, one of the four capacities, is to create responsible citizens. And that aspiration runs right through the curricular approach in the 3 to 18 curriculum that we have. So from the earliest interaction that young people have with our education system, that importance of becoming a responsible citizen is imbued into the educational model that we take forward. Very specifically on these incidents that we've had over the summer, the Chief Inspector of Education wrote to all local authorities to convey guidance and educational materials that could be utilised by the school system, obviously when the school system returned in August, to make sure that materials were available to schools to support them in the important work, which I agree with Mr Cole-Hamilton, has to be taken forward to ensure that young people are exposed to the most considered material that supports them to become responsible citizens and to turn their back on any involvement in the violence and the prejudice that we saw in the streets of England and Northern Ireland.
Evelyn Tweed, to be followed by Russell Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the First Minister's statement today. Like many places, misinformation on the nature of a recent serious incident in Stirling spread rapidly online. Can the First Minister further outline what action needs to be taken to ensure that websites such as X, Meta and TikTok combat the spread of misinformation and address racist and hateful material on their platforms? Have social media platforms provided reassurance?
Minister. I have been in touch with social media companies and I've had responses from some of them about the steps that they take, and they provide some degree of assurance about material that is taken down. I don't think that goes nearly far enough. I think it's quite easy to view material which I consider to be completely and utterly repugnant online and to be unacceptable. Ofcom have very, very strict and clear guidelines in place. My sense is that those are not being respected by the social media companies, and we will engage in dialogue with the UK Government to make sure that whatever strengthening is required to do that will be undertaken. But the social media companies have a responsibility to exercise that, and they could exercise it this minute to protect communities from being exposed to unacceptable material.
Russell Finlay, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you. I echo the sentiments raised by colleagues across the chamber. We all have a duty to stand up to bigotry and racism in all its forms. And it's important to recognise that the response to these riots showed the overwhelming tolerance and decency of people across the UK. Presiding Officer, we've already heard that police officer numbers in Scotland are at their lowest in 17 years. And today it's been reported that an additional 1,000 officers are eligible to retire in the coming year. So I'd like to ask the First Minister if he can tell us what he considers to be the minimum number of officers required to keep our communities safe.
First Minister.
Obviously, the number of police officers is an operational matter for the Chief Constable. Obviously, there are discussions between Government and the Chief Constable about these matters and the Scottish Police Authority. But we expect, as I said to Mr Ross in my earlier answer, there has been a fall in police numbers because, actually in part driven by the issue that Mr Finlay raises, of a larger number of retirals than were expected. But the recruitment is underway to replace those individuals, and we expect police numbers to rise. But I do reiterate the point that we've had police numbers at the level we've had in Scotland, which I accept is lower than they have been, but we've also been able to offer mutual aid to other forces where that's been requested, and communities in Scotland have remained safe.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Katie Clark.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's vital that we do all we can to reach out to our faith and migrant communities to offer solidarity, support and the reassurance that they enrich the social and cultural fabric of our nation. With this in mind, can the First Minister provide further detail on the work being supported to promote community cohesion across the country?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, there is a great deal of work underway in this respect through the dialogue we have with stakeholder organisations who are very well connected within communities. The Justice Secretary and I went to visit the Edinburgh Central Mosque during this incident, and it was reassuring to hear the comments being made by the members of the Muslim community about their relationship with the police and the dialogue that takes place. I had my own experience of that when I visited a synagogue in East Renfrewshire, and I met with the Jewish community, and I heard similarly of their appreciation of the assurance of their safety that was undertaken, although they highlighted to me the fact that they feel at times very, very unsafe and fearful. So we have to actively support that activity, and I assure Rona Mackay that that work is underway within Scotland today.
Katie Clark, to be followed by Ben McPherson.
Does the First Minister agree with me that the rise of the far right is a problem across the UK, with many in society feeling alienated and disenfranchised? What more does he think can be done to work with community organisations, trade unions and others to support groups affected, but also to combat this ideology?
First Minister.
I think there's two aspects to that. I very much agree with the aspirations that Katie Clark sets out in her question, and I think there's 2 points of response that I would make. One is that I think we have got relentlessly to give the political leadership about the value and the inclusivity of our communities, and not to allow anything at all to get in the way of our unity about that point. It is precious to me, and that's why I valued the engagement of political leaders over the summer. The second thing is about social and economic policy choices and frankly about austerity. I think enormous damage has been done to our society in the last 14 years in this period of austerity, and I want it to come to an end, because we need to reinvest in our communities. We need to tackle the challenge of poverty. I will say more about this in the programme for government tomorrow, because I believe that is the feeding ground of some of this misplaced ideology.
Ben Macpherson, to be followed by Christine Graham.
In continually working to protect, promote and enhance community cohesion and inclusion, would the First Minister wish to further emphasise our shared admiration for the important contribution that local organisations and individuals across Scotland make to proactively, positively, tenaciously and regularly bring people together as fellow citizens and human beings through various initiatives, communications and events, and who also work to support new Scots in our communities. Remarkable organisations like the Multicultural Family Base, the Edinburgh Interfaith Association, Building Bridges and the Welcoming here in the capital.
First Minister.
I agree very much with Ben Macpherson. I think there's a whole host of community organisations that do remarkable work in bringing people together. They exist across all communities. I had a conversation with Mr Carlaw during the summer about organisations that come together in his constituency to support communities which provided welcome assistance and assurance for individuals, and I would encourage them to continue to do that and to express my appreciation for all that they do.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Pam Gossel.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. On the streets of Southport were thugs, racists and all manner of extremists, but there were also people from what one might call, inverted commas, deprived areas, close commas, inverted commas, generally raging against the political establishment. Does that 60% turnout at the recent election not tell us that politics is failing when some choose bricks, not the ballot box, and that the cohesion Patrick Harvey referred to will be severely tested under increasing austerity?
First Minister.
I've made clear my point, that in my view, that austerity is causing damage to our communities, and I want to see that resolved. I don't think that I cannot summon up any kind of appreciation or understanding why somebody wants to engage in violence. I just can't understand it at all. So I think it's got no justification. And political participation is an essential way to resolve any differences and debates within our society, and we should all engage in that. So I think it's important to separate out these different things. I think we should make our political choices, exercise our political leadership, and encourage people to participate in the political process, and be absolutely and completely resolute in rejecting any sense that there is any excuse or legitimacy for violence in our society, which I know Christine Graham will, that will not be her view, and we have to set that out very clearly to ensure that the public are protected and that we invest in and support our communities.
Pam Gossel, to be followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland was not exempt from the turmoil that occurred last month. While no riots broke out in Scotland, ethnic minority constituents in my region contacted me to say they felt unsafe. So unsafe that they decided to stay at home or close their businesses until tensions calmed. What action is the First Minister taking to build community cohesion, not just between civil servants and community leaders, but between members of the community? Will there be an increase in community outreach initiatives and community hubs?
First Minister.
I think it's important that we encourage and enable the cohesion of communities. Some of that comes about by political leadership, some of it comes about by community work, some of it comes about by the active investment of social and economic priorities within the Government's programme and the programme of local authorities. And of course our local authorities are heavily involved in all of this work on community cohesion at local level. So it's so important that we remain focused on that. I think it's unacceptable that anybody should feel unsafe in our society. I think it's unacceptable that somebody has got to close their business because they're fearful of being attacked. That's completely repugnant to me. Police Scotland are prepared to be visible and active to protect people, and they have done so. So I think a combination of those measures, investment in our communities, effective policing and strong, clear political leadership will help us through these difficulties.
And Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Stand Up to Racism Scotland has planned a family-friendly, safely stewarded mass event with support from trade unions and civil society organisations this coming Saturday. What advice will the FM provide to people wishing to attend this rally to express solidarity with communities affected by these recent disorders and for them to stay safe?
First Minister.
So I would simply encourage people who intend to attend any such event to follow the guidance that is available, to follow any advice from the police, fundamentally to stay safe and to engage in democratic, peaceful protest. There is a place for democratic, peaceful protest in our society. I think Parliament will be familiar. I've been on a few of these myself over my time. But there's a place for democratic engagement, but it's got to be done in a peaceful fashion, and I'm sure that will be followed this weekend.
Thank you. That concludes the Ministerial Statement on community cohesion. I'll allow a moment or two for front benches to organise before we move on to the next item of business.
Thank you. The next item of business is a statement by Shona Robison on Scottish Government pre-budget fiscal update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and therefore there should be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Shona Robison, Cabinet Secretary. Up to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Government has consistently warned of the significance of the financial challenge ahead. Prolonged Westminster austerity, the economic damage of Brexit, a global pandemic, the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis have all placed enormous and growing pressure on the public finances. In the last 3 years alone, cumulative CPI inflation has seen prices increase by 18.9%, diminishing how far money will go for households and governments alike. In the face of these challenges, the Scottish Government has stepped in to support people and services where it has been needed most on social security, health and public services. As set out in our 2024-25 budget, we have delivered a real terms uplift for the NHS. We've continued to tackle inequality by committing £6.1 billion in social security benefits and payments, including increasing the Scottish Child Payment to £26.70 a week, helping the families of over 325,000 under-16s who currently receive it. But we've done so without the equivalent UK Government action and their repeated failure to properly review the adequacy of funding settlements. This issue has been acutely felt across the 4 nations. Just last year, the Welsh Government had to introduce emergency savings measures in order to balance its budget, and in 22-23 the Northern Ireland Executive needed to draw down from the UK reserve. The new Labour UK Government has since confirmed the failures of the past administration, outlining that the previous UK Government, and I quote the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, quotes, never fully reflected the impact of inflation in departmental budgets. The Treasury's audit has estimated that this year's departmental spending budgets are at least £15 billion lower in real terms compared to 2021 spending review plans. The Chancellor has set out the £22 billion funding gap inherited from the previous administration, and the Prime Minister confirmed that the forthcoming UK budget will be painful as they seek to address the fiscal position. Now, while it's welcome that the new UK Government has accepted the diagnosis that we've given for years on the UK's public finances, their solution is sadly looking like an extension of the folly of austerity. I made clear there was a difficult financial outlook in last year's medium-term financial strategy. I set out the projected and growing gap between forecast funding and planned spending in Scotland. At the time, this was forecast to be £1 billion in 2024-25, rising to £1.9 billion by 2027-28, and I made clear that this was not sustainable, and I called on the UK Government to act. At the same time, with the powers at our own hand, I announced a range of measures at the budget 2024-25 to support the delivery of a balanced position whilst protecting public services. However, given the circumstances and the uncertainty about additional funding and further in-year pressures, I must take further and more urgent action now to ensure that we can balance the Scottish budget in 2024-25. Presiding Officer, pay continues to be a significant driver of in-year pressures, with expected additional costs of up to £0.8 billion in this financial year alone. Whilst I welcome the UK Government's acceptance of the pay review body recommendations, it remains to be seen whether the UK Government will fully fund it. Simply, if they do not fully fund the pay deals, it will leave a substantial gap between the expectations of the workforce and the available funding. In addition, we must also recognise that we have a larger public sector in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. Our public sector workforce will need to evolve to ensure the delivery of high-quality public services within continued Westminster austerity, and I will set out more detail on our approach in the budget. Alongside pay, there are, of course, other pressures that arise in year that we must ensure are funded. There are costs that emerge due to natural demand-led changes, for example, legal aid, police and fire pensions, and the costs of accommodation for Ukrainian displaced people. And more widely, the budget must still be managed for wider operational pressures. Most notably, NHS boards are having to address the significant health and social care backlog that arose during the COVID pandemic and a recent further surge in COVID and respiratory cases. While the Scottish Government has to operate within a largely fixed budget determined by Westminster, this Government will, of course, do everything we can to protect people and the public. Of course, were Scotland an independent country, then we would not be paying the price for bad decisions taken at Westminster, whether that be years of austerity cuts, Brexit or reckless mini-budgets, all of which have taken money out of the economy and funding for public services. However, Presiding Officer, within the current devolution settlement, the fact remains that our main lever to remove these pressures in year is to reduce spending to achieve balance. And that's why I'm setting out today a range of measures to support the 2024-25 budget, totalling almost £1 billion, of which up to £500 million are direct savings. The savings include up to £60 million of further savings that will be realised through the implementation of the emergency spend controls, particularly targeting recruitment, overtime, travel and marketing. As previously announced, we will not progress with the removal of rail peak fares or the concessionary fares extension to the asylum seekers pilot. We've also agreed with the local government that they can draw on specific existing programmes to fund pay deals. Collectively, these decisions amount to a further £65 million of savings. We'll make a further £188 million of additional specific savings across all portfolios. This includes a reduction in resource spend on sustainable and active travel and increased interest income on Scottish Water loan balances. Full details are being shared with the Finance and Public Administration Committee and published alongside this statement. These savings should also be considered in the context of the recent and regrettable Scottish Government decision to mirror the UK Government decision not to retain universality in the winter fuel payment, which would have cost up to £160 million. At present, I am also reluctantly planning on the basis of utilising up to £460 million of additional Scotland revenue funding. In the past, it has allowed me to protect budgets from cuts that would otherwise have been made. This includes being able to continue to support net zero expenditure. As the final year progresses and through our emergency spend controls and continued robust forecasting, I am seeking to protect as far as possible that Scotland revenue, just as I was able to do in 2023-24. Presiding Officer, as we look ahead, it is clear that further significant action will be needed to reset the public finances onto a sustainable path. The Chancellor has made clear that UK Government funding will continue to be tightly constrained. The Prime Minister has also made clear the difficult decisions to come. Ahead of the autumn budget, we call again on the UK Government to ensure that it prioritises investment in public services and infrastructure. We know from bitter experience that yet more Westminster austerity is not the answer, and public services must be protected. However, if the Scottish Government does not act, then spending will continue to outstrip available funding. That's not sustainable, and tough decisions will be required. Annual savings alone will not address this. So all members of this place must face up to this challenge and the demands they make during the budget process to come. On public spending, our approach to the forthcoming budget will be focused on action in key areas to address spending pressures, some of which I want to highlight today. First, let me turn to health. We will take forward our vision for health and social care reform. This Government will always prioritise funding for our NHS, and in the 2025-26 budget, we will build on the record funding that we have allocated in the current financial year. We will take the twin approach of investment and reform in our health services, an approach which rightly tackles the population health challenges we face. Where necessary, that must mean realigning spend to ensure it reaches those that need it most. Beyond health, we will also continue to identify and implement opportunities to deprioritise lower impact spend and programmes across the whole of government. I will use the forthcoming budget to highlight how we will double down on reform opportunities and maximise efficiencies, with a particular focus on the operation of public bodies and driving further savings through efficiency levers. This includes opportunities around estates, procurement, fund management, digital shared services and revenue raising. On workforce, we have recruitment freezes in place across the Scottish Government for all but the most essential roles, and where appropriate, I am looking to extend that across public bodies, while ensuring that frontline services and the like of our NHS, police and fire can recruit the staff that they need. Presiding Officer, we also face significant pressures on our capital budget. The sustained high level of inflation experienced in the construction sector has permanently increased the cost of delivering infrastructure. This coincides with an expected real terms reduction to our UK capital funding of 8.7% over 5 years. This equates to a cumulative loss of over £1.3 billion between 2023-24 and 2027-28. As indicated previously, our financial transaction allocation from the UK Government has dropped by £290 million, or 62%, since 2022-23, adding to the challenge we already face. These factors combined have reduced our spending power, and we cannot afford all of our capital commitments. We will need to continue to make difficult decisions to ensure that our capital programme is affordable and deliverable. In line with our investment hierarchy, we are focusing spend on essential maintenance of our infrastructure so we can continue to deliver high-quality public services. And whilst these will be difficult choices, this Government remains committed to protecting the most vulnerable in society. Our approach to equality budgeting will be strengthened further for the 2025-26 budget by publishing the results of our gender budgeting pilot with the OECD.
On tax, I can confirm that we'll publish our tax strategy alongside the 2025-26 Scottish Budget, where we'll set out our medium-term ambitions for the Scottish tax system. Of course, our cumulative decisions on income tax since the devolution of powers are estimated to have raised around £1.5 billion in 2024-25 compared to if we had UK rates and bans. This is additional revenue which has been used to support our vital public services. And of course, anyone who would advocate removing the progressive changes to income tax in Scotland will need to set out where the £1.5 billion of cuts would fall as a consequence. On the application of taxation, we can only go so far, given the scope of our devolved tax powers. Raising significant further revenue would require substantial reform to the tax system or the further devolution of powers. These will take time and will rely on the UK Government. It's therefore essential that we aim to grow the economy and the tax base to support a sustained flow of revenues over time. Since 2007, Scotland's economy has grown faster than the UK as a whole after accounting for population growth, and productivity has grown twice as quickly. And this, of course, has supported growth in Scottish tax revenues. Boosting economic growth is a top priority for our Government because it is key to both raising Scotland's living standards and funding the public services that we all rely upon. This is even more important given that Brexit has estimated to have left the UK economy at least £69 billion worse off compared with EU membership. And that's why our programme for Government tomorrow will set out in detail the steps it will take this year to boost fair, green economic growth. As members will be aware, I recently wrote to the Finance and Public Administration Committee to provide an update on the timing of the Scottish Budget. I also stated that I intend to publish the medium-term financial strategy after the UK Government's multi-year spending review has concluded in the spring. I'm giving careful consideration to the timing of a spending review in Scotland and to establishing a regular rhythm of reviews. I can confirm to Parliament that I have proposed that the next Scottish Budget takes place on the 4th of December, and I'm continuing to discuss the budget date with the Finance and Public Administration Committee and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and will finalise this in due course. Finally, Presiding Officer, we cannot ignore the severe financial challenges that we face. We will continue to be a fiscally responsible government and balance the budget each year, as we have done every year for 17 years, and we will do so again this year. But this will mean we must unfortunately take difficult decisions along the way. I believe we can all agree on the importance of putting the public first in all that we do. And I'm calling on members across the Chamber to work together to navigate the challenges ahead in the best interests of all of the people that we have the privilege to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 30 minutes for questions, after which time we will move on to the next item of business. And it would be helpful if those members who would wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Liz Smith.
Thank you. The Scottish Fiscal Commission has made it abundantly clear that much of the pressure that is facing the country's finances is down to the Scottish Government's own decisions. For example, it cited the above-inflation pay settlements for public sector workers, the extent of the gap between the spending on devolved social security and the associated BGA funding, and, as Professor Roy said this morning, again, the fact that the Scottish economy has not been growing at the same rate as the UK economy since income tax was devolved. The Scottish Government is missing out on £624 million, which of course just happens to be very close to the total sum of the swingeing expenditure cuts that the Finance Secretary is announcing today. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary three things? Given the recent independent analysis, will the Cabinet Secretary finally put on the record that the large black hole in Scotland's public finances is a result of the actions of the Scottish Government and not the actions of Westminster? Secondly, Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify the Scottish Government's tax strategy in relation to economic growth? On the one hand, we have the Deputy First Minister repeatedly warning of the dangers of the SNP's counterproductive income tax rises, which could further hamper growth and investment. But on the other hand, we have the First Minister saying that higher taxes are necessary to maintain the SNP's so-called social contract. Who is right, Cabinet Secretary? And thirdly, in light of the very hard choices that the Cabinet Secretary is outlining today and the corresponding unaffordability of many aspects of the Scottish Government's spending commitments, does the Scottish Government not agree that it is time to review universal payments, some of which are paid to better-off recipients?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, let me say to Liz Smith, our choices of a government have been to invest in social security measures like the Scottish Child Payment, keeping 100,000 children out of poverty. Now, if Liz Smith is arguing on behalf of the Conservatives as that is a wrong priority, then that is for her and her party to defend in public. Secondly, on funding fair pay deals, yes, we have funded fair pay deals, and that has meant we have avoided some of the costly industrial action that we've seen blight public services in other parts of the UK, costly to the NHS in particular. So I will make no apologies for the investment decisions that we have made. And of course, she makes an important point about the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who of course also said that there is significant uncertainty about the funding that we can expect to receive from the UK Government. So in the light of the UK Government accepting the UK pay review body's recommendations, this Government is having to take the action to make sure that we can create the headroom to fund those pay deals, because I'm assuming Liz Smith is also not arguing that we should not be paying the nurses here in Scotland the same pay deal that they're going to get in England. I'm sure she is not intending to say that. And finally, on the Scottish economy, we absolutely want to grow the Scottish economy. And of course, in terms of the emphasis being put by that, you'll see that in the programme for government tomorrow in terms of the green and fair economy. But we are also investing more than £5 billion this year to support economic growth. Scotland is absolutely open for business. You can see from the figures around productivity and growth that the Scottish economy is doing rather better than Liz Smith and her colleagues would have us believe, and we'll continue to make the investments to ensure that that's the case.
Presiding Officer, instead of gripping their government's crisis in Scotland's public finances, this statement is a threadbare attempt to once again pass the buck. After 17 years in power, always someone else to blame, again and again. Because what the public must know is that all of the independent experts, the Fraser of Allender Institute, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Audit Scotland, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, all of them are absolutely clear that these SNP cuts stem from this SNP government's incompetence. It's SNP mismanagement of the public's money from a government that I'm afraid has long since lost its way. And the culture of always blaming someone else comes with a cost, and it's meted out in jobs and service cuts. When we have the longest NHS waiting lists in history, and attainment is dropping in our schools. Scots are left paying more and getting less. And almost half of the total adjustments laid out today are pulled from a one-off raid on Scotland money, lost now into the black hole rather than investing for our future. It almost guarantees that this cycle of short-term sticking plaster politics will run and run. So, Presiding Officer, when will the Finance Secretary publish the real, full details, frankly any details, of these incompetent cuts? And because after 3 years of annual chaotic emergency spending reviews, and what looks like another exercise in kicking the can down the road, will she confirm today what the date of next year's crisis cut statement will be, so we can all get it in the diary?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, I think Michael Mara should read my lips. Labour austerity is as damaging as Tory austerity when it comes to public service cuts. And for Michael Mara to come to this chamber on behalf of the Labour Party, where the Labour Prime Minister has announced in the gardens of Downing Street that there is a difficult, tough budget coming, immediately after the Labour Chancellor announcing £22 billion of public sector funding reductions. It is a bit rich for Michael Mara to come here and lecture anyone about the public finances. I'm also assuming from what Michael Mara said that if he was standing in this position, he would make another £460 million of cuts rather than utilising the ScotWind resources. ScotWind resources that this government has enabled to happen here in Scotland that have supported public finances. So let's cut to the chase here. We are going to see Labour presiding over austerity and cuts that make the Tory cuts look like a pale imitation, and yet will come here and try to make out that somehow Scotland is some exception here, unlike in Wales, where his colleagues have had to make extremely difficult decisions because of austerity, and the same issue in Northern Ireland, where they have not been able to balance their budget. All of us are facing the same problems, and we will point out exactly where the root of them lies.
I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I recognise the financial challenges we face, although it's important to note the budget will be fully spent as resources are reallocated into pay. In times of adversity and with increasing demands on services, we must deliver more efficiently, not least through digitisation, while growing the economy, improving productivity and widening the tax base. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain how she will prioritise investment, partnering with the private sector where Scotland is globally competitive, such as in life sciences, financial services, information technology and food and drink, to create and sustain skilled, well-paid employment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Scottish Government and, of course, its enterprise agencies and the Scottish National Investment Bank will work very closely with the private sector to drive the growth in all of those sectors that Kenny Gibson mentioned. And, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the annual results of both the Bank and Scottish Enterprise demonstrating their impact on investment. So since the launch, the Bank has committed £645 million and brought in a further £1 billion in additional third-party investment into 35 businesses and projects. And last year, Scottish Enterprise helped companies raise over £350 million of growth funding, unlocking nearly £1.9 billion in capital investment for companies and delivering over £2 billion of planned international sales. I think that is a good record of success, and we want to see more of it.
I call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Growth in the economy is essential to provide the additional revenues we require to fund public services. But the reality is that since 2014, over the last decade, the Scottish economy has grown on average at 1/2 the rate of the UK as a whole. Previously, the Scottish Government cut employability programmes, the very initiatives that help economic inclusion and drive growth. So what assessment has been made of the impact on growth of all the extra cuts that have just been announced today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, all of the assessments have been done on all of the savings have sought to minimise the impact on all of the government's priorities. But there's no getting away from the fact that in order to make sure we balance our budget this year, difficult decisions have had to be made, and we have tried to avoid the impact on public services and on frontline services where we can. Despite some of the cuts that Murdo Fraser has referred to, we are seeing absolutely fantastic performance from Scottish Enterprise and the Scottish National Investment Bank. And the figures I laid out in my statement around the performance of the Scottish economy, I know it's not the narrative that the Scottish Conservatives like to hear, but actually the Scottish economy is doing rather well. Is there room for it to do better? Yes, there is, and that's why in the programme for government, Parliament will hear more about the focus on the green, fair economy and the measures we're going to put in place to make sure we maximise the potential there.
I call Michelle Thompson, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I note the Scottish Government intends to use up to 100% of ScotWind monies available from year 2023 to 2024, i.e. £460 million to fund day-to-day resource spending. Given this is a one-off bounty, the original intention had been to help develop vital supply chains and infrastructure in our renewable sector, and it could also have been used as a tool to crowd in private capital. However, the use of the term "up to" is key, so can the Cabinet Secretary set out the circumstances where these vital one-off funds can and will be protected and invested to create future wealth for Scotland, such as a sovereign wealth fund? And can she also outline her intention for the remaining £200 million available in year 2024 to 2025? Is that also being earmarked for day-to-day spending?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say to Michelle Thompson, as I said in my statement, it is not what I would want to be doing in having to utilise ScotWind monies for day-to-day spend. But given the choice in front of us, with the in-year levers essentially being spending control being the main lever that we have at our disposal, then I would have to go further and deeper on spending reductions in order to minimise the ScotWind utilisation. Now, having said that, as I also laid out in my statement, because of the actions we took last year, we were able to reduce the call upon ScotWind resources through the year, and then we drew down less than we had anticipated having to do. It would be absolutely my intention to try to do that this year, because Michelle Thompson makes a very good point. Whether it's about using ScotWind to invest in infrastructure, or indeed making sure we have ScotWind as a backstop in future years, that will absolutely be my intention. I'm happy to keep Parliament updated on the progress of doing so.
I call Daniel Johnson before
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd just like to push the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on this point. She's identified a £1 billion shortfall in the Scottish Government's funding before we've even had a budget from the UK Government, that she seeks to fill using £460 million of ScotWind money. Can she confirm that is non-recurring? And if so, does that not mean that she's just simply going to have to find another £500 million worth of cuts in the budget when she publishes it on the 4th of December?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the budget that I publish on the 4th of December, of course, will be guided very much by what the Labour Chancellor publishes at the end of October. Now, if what the member is saying to me is that it's going to be so grim that I'm going to have to set out a further £500 million of cuts, then I am deeply disturbed by that prospect. Let's be really clear, the vast majority of funding for the Scottish Government is reliant upon UK Government budget decisions. End of. That is a fact. In terms of the levers we have, I've already said to Michelle Thompson, of course we want to utilise ScotWind over a number of years rather than having to use it in 1 year, because it is, as Daniel Johnson said, non-recurring. And I will do my level best to avoid having to do that. The pressure this year, in the main, emanates from pay pressure. £800 million of additional pay pressure driven by the acceptance of the UK pay review bodies. And that is not at the moment confirmed that it will be fully funded. In the absence of that being fully funded, we have to create the headroom in order to pay for Agenda for Change and other pay deals, because I am assuming that Daniel Johnson is not suggesting that we don't pay our nurses or our doctors or our teachers the pay uplifts that are being given elsewhere. So in the light of that, we have to make sure we have the headroom to pay for the pay deals. I'm happy to explain it in further detail to Daniel Johnson if he requires.
Can I just take this opportunity to say to our friends on these benches that we must have much less chuntering while somebody else has the floor. Thank you. I call Stewart McMillan to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Finance Secretary spoke about NHS reform in her statement. And can the Finance Secretary provide an assurance that the free eye tests will remain, as they have multiple benefits for people and also their eye health care?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, quite obviously the Labour bench doesn't really care about eye health care. So let me say to Stewart McMillan, Scotland is the only country in the UK to provide free universal NHS-funded eye examinations, and maintaining this is a Scottish Government commitment. It's critical that flagship services such as this are protected so that patients have no financial barriers to accessing services, and that we have the capacity to support safe, high-quality management of patients in the community. And I hope that reassures Stewart McMillan.
I call Ross Greer to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you. Wes Drayton was right to say that all roads lead back to Westminster. Nowhere is that more true than the last 14 years of cuts to public services. But the Scottish Government has choices. The SNP have chosen to slash spending on climate action, hitting budgets for nature restoration, walking, wheeling, cycling, bringing back peak rail fares and raiding ScotWind offshore wind income. Contrast that to the untouched £700 million of business tax breaks, £250 million of which is the SBBS, a scheme for which the Government's own independent review could find no evidence of enhanced business outcomes, and which, despite having small business in the name, throws public money at large and extremely profitable companies, and even at the shooting estates of the landed elite. So why have the SNP chosen to continue handing public cash to big business and elite landowners while slashing critical spending to tackle the climate emergency?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, let me first of all, on a point of agreement with Ross Greer about all roads lead to Westminster, as Wes Streeting made clear during the election campaign, and we agree with him on that point. In terms of the choices that we can make in year, as Ross Greer will know, there are very limited options when you're trying to balance a budget in year. That is a different matter from budget choices that we may choose or not choose to make, and that is when we will set out our tax and spending plans. But in year, we have to take the difficult choices, and many of those are choices of programmes that are not yet underway. And unfortunately, many of those are in the active travel area. That does not diminish the fact that we have put significantly more resources into active travel, and we will continue to do so. But the programmes that have been impacted here, unfortunately, were required in order to make sure we can balance the budget.
I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The UK Government's spending plans are going to have substantial implications for Scotland's budget next year. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to provide any further information regarding when the Scottish Government expects to receive further detail regarding the consequentials which it will receive for 2024-25?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. Can I thank Jackie Dunbar for her question? So the Scottish Government continues to discuss the overall financial position with the Treasury, and on another point of consensus and positivity, because I'm obviously always full of positivity, the Treasury in their day-to-day communications with the Scottish Government, there has been a marked improvement, I would have to say, and that is helpful in terms of the relationship and the flow of communication. So let me put that on record. But final Barnett consequentials will not be confirmed until UK supplementary estimates, which completes in late January, early February, although I would expect some formal indication of additional funding at the UK budget on the 30th of October. Now, what we do know from what the Prime Minister has said is that that budget is likely to be extremely difficult. What we don't know as yet is what departments will be particularly hit by those budget decisions. And of course, if those are devolved areas of spend, then that directly impacts on the budget available in Scotland, and we will set all of that out in due course.
I call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Across Scotland, all of our constituents are working harder, but it feels like they're falling further behind. They're just not buying these excuses anymore. Now, the SNP for decades lectured Margaret Thatcher about failing to create a sovereign wealth fund for the oil that was found underneath Scotland's seabed. Now, that's exactly what it's failed to do in terms of the wind farms now being built upon it. Now, when the government draws down this £460 million, as we know they very well might, as Daniel Johnson says, that is a one-off spend. That is a hole that will need to be filled next year. I want to understand from the government, the Finance Secretary, how she intends to fill that, or are there other one-off expenses that we'll just have to make do with?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say to Alex Cole-Hamilton that we, of course, unlike other independent countries that have developed sovereign wealth funds, who have all the fiscal levers available to them, we do not have those fiscal levers. The only fiscal lever we have in year to meet pressures like pay review body recommendations being accepted but not fully funded are spending reductions. Now, if I was to contain the Scotland revenues intact, I'm afraid I would be coming here and announcing a further £460 million of public spending reductions. And I'm sure that Alex Cole-Hamilton would not want me to do that as my first priority, given what that would mean. Having said that, and I hope I've been clear on this point, I will do everything within my power to drive down the utilisation of the Scotland revenues for all of the reasons that we understand that have been articulated in this chamber. I did that last year and drew down much less than we had anticipated having to do, and I will do the same this year as well.
I call Christine Graham to be followed by Pam Gozel.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Labour Government's first move, of course not in their manifesto, was to base winter fuel payment on pension credit, knowing that 40% entitled do not claim. And of course they cut our funding to make it universal. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that Labour should explain and indeed apologise to the estimated 929 households in my constituency, Midlothian South and Tweedale, which have not claimed pension credit, will lose this vital support in winters actually incredibly colder than those in London and the home counties where these decisions are taken?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it is one of the most regrettable decisions that the UK Labour Government have made, and of course didn't tell anyone about it during the election campaign, and nor would they of course accept the public expenditure cuts that the First Minister told them was coming down the line, and that was denied. And yet here we are, with all of the Labour austerity being laid out, a difficult budget coming, and of course the changes to winter fuel payment removing that benefit from millions and millions of pensioners. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government's position is I cannot find £160 million from other budgets, whether it's the health budget or anywhere else, to replace the money that we will not secure from the UK Government for winter fuel payments. I have no choice in that matter, but I think, as Christine Graham has said, it is a deeply disturbing and upsetting decision, particularly given the climate here in Scotland.
I call Pam Gozel to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Caroline Lamb, the Director-General for Health and Social Care, has said that funding for Scotland's public services have reached a tipping point, and implied that the universal benefits cut may be on the cards. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether this is correct?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, let me say to Pam Gozel that, of course, the 2024-25 budget provided funding of over £19.5 billion for health and social care, giving our NHS a real terms uplift. Reform, though, of how health and social care services operate has never been more urgent, and I set that out in the statement in terms of that being a priority. In terms of the decisions going forward around those difficult decisions, and of course we believe that many of those investments are absolutely vital, whether that's in our system of free university education and not putting financial barriers in the way of young people getting an education and not putting financial barriers in the way of people accessing their prescriptions, for example. These are really important things that have been invested in and built upon. Does that mean there are not difficult decisions to make as part of the budget process? No, of course there will be difficult decisions to make as part of the budget process, and we'll set out the decisions that we're making when I come on the 4th of December.
I call Jackie Bailey to be followed by James Dornan.
In a letter to Health Board's Caroline Lamb, the Chief Executive of the NHS warned that there is a £1.1 billion black hole at the heart of the NHS budget for this year. In the documents provided by the Cabinet Secretary today, she has slashed a further £115 million from the health and social care budget, from mental health services, from primary care services, from the Independent Living Fund, an attack on disabled people in our community. How is that protecting NHS and social care? And the Cabinet Secretary talks about prioritising essential NHS jobs. So why are there vacancy freezes for consultants and nurses? Are they not essential jobs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, on the Independent Living Fund, Jackie Bailey should be accurate in this chamber. Of course, the Independent Living Fund is based on what the predicted number of applicants is going to be for the Independent Living Fund that we, of course, have re-established here in Scotland. I don't think it's going to be re-established in England, where, of course, Labour are in power. In terms of the mental health services, of course, we have continued to invest in mental health services in excess of £1.3 billion for mental health, and that includes £120 million of direct funding to NHS boards and IJBs. Does this mean that health and social care is immune from some of these difficult decisions? No, it doesn't. But I know that colleagues, Neil Gray and his team, have worked extremely hard to make sure that the £115 million will have the minimal impact on frontline services. And finally, on the payment of nurses and doctors, that's exactly why we want to meet the pay review body recommendations, in order to make sure that nurses and doctors are paid. We have done that in Scotland, where we have seen nurses and doctors on strike in other parts of the UK, but we have made sure through fair funding we have avoided industrial action in the health service here in Scotland. And in terms of those urgent posts, those emergency cuts, I have made very clear again, if Jackie Bailey had been listening, that essential posts on front line, whether it's in health, police or fire, will be protected in terms of recruitment. So let me just put that on the record again for the avoidance of doubt, Presiding Officer.
I call James Dornan, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Brian Whittle. Mr Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, the new Labour government at Westminster has the levers to end austerity, but they're choosing not to. Do you agree with me that the case couldn't be clearer for full fiscal powers to be devolved to Scotland, so we can deliver the investment in public services in our communities that people deserve?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I agree with James Dornan in that we are doing all that we can within the limited powers that we have? But of course we could do so much more with the full set of fiscal powers that other European countries of our size have at their disposal. And if we did have those full fiscal powers, we would not be paying the price for bad decisions taken at Westminster, whether that be the years of austerity cuts started under the Tories, now continued under Labour, Brexit, reckless mini-budgets, all of which have taken money out of the economy and funding for public services reductions. So I'll continue to make the case for this Parliament to have the fiscal powers of a normal independent country. But in the meantime, we need the Chancellor to use her forthcoming budget to provide the funding that our public services, infrastructure and communities so badly need.
I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Nowhere in the Cabinet Secretary's statement did she acknowledge the importance of the private sector to economic growth or the opportunities presented from unlocking greater private sector investment. Was this an oversight, or yet more evidence that this is the Scottish Government where business and entrepreneurship is always an afterthought?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Brian Whittle should have listened more closely to my statement, because I literally talked about our absolute commitment to economic growth. I talked about the look ahead to the programme for government that was going to focus on fair green growth and the levers that we would use in order to do that. And of course we've seen in terms of the positive aspects of the Scottish economy, I outlined some of those earlier on, we see record levels of foreign direct investment beyond anywhere else in these islands. Presiding officer. So, I know that Brian Whittle will not want to hear these positive aspects of the Scottish economy, but for the avoidance of doubt, again, let me say that economic growth and green economic growth is absolutely key to the future success of this country, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow in the programme for government.
And I can squeeze in Audrey Nicholl to be followed by John Mason if both members are brief. Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary understands the significant role of community justice approaches in their contribution to a whole range of national outcomes, including reducing reoffending, addressing homelessness and tackling child poverty. So given the new Labour government at Westminster are already turning their backs on the most vulnerable, what assurance can the Cabinet Secretary provide that funding in this vital space will be sufficient to support continued delivery of community justice approaches, particularly given the pressures being faced in other parts of the justice system?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Audrey Nicholl makes a good point, and of course we are investing a total of £148 million in community justice this year. This includes an additional £14 million which will build the capacity of justice social work services and strengthen alternatives to custody across Scotland. And this increased investment underlines the Scottish Government's continued commitment to community justice and reflects evidence that such approaches can be more effective than short-term imprisonment at reducing reoffending, assisting with rehabilitation and ultimately ensuring there are fewer victims of crime.
And I call John Mason.
Thank you very much. It was encouraging that the Cabinet Secretary said that she has a slightly better relationship with the Westminster Government than previously. Has she had any indication or hope that in the area of capital expenditure and maybe financial transactions, Westminster might allow a bit more leeway?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I have to say to John Mason, it is a very low bar, but the signals in terms of communication have been a marked improvement. So the issue of capital investment, which of course will form part of the spending review of the UK Government that will be produced in the spring, and the issue of financial transactions, the First Minister and I raised those directly with the Chancellor when we met her last week, I think it was. And we impressed upon her the importance of being able to invest in our infrastructure, and not from a public service point of view, but also from an economic point of view. So we were very, very clear why that was important, and I will continue to press that point with her and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the statement. I allowed it to run on a wee bit, but we do have to protect the rest of the afternoon's business. There will be a short pause before we move on to that to allow frontbench teams to change position, should they so wish. Thank you.
Okay, the next item of business is a statement by Jenny Minto on gender identity healthcare for young people, update and new national standards. The Minister will take questions at the end of her statement, therefore there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Jenny Minto around 10 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to provide a further update in person to Parliament on this work. I would like to start by speaking directly to trans and non-binary young people in Scotland. I know waiting times to access the specialist services which provide support for gender dysphoria, alongside the ongoing changes to how these services are provided, are worrying for you and your families. I have heard this directly from you in the meetings we've had, and I've read it in the correspondence which I've received from you and those that love you. I also know that high levels of ongoing speculation and interest in these services, along with accompanying and often toxic commentary, whether online, in print or in person, can magnify your worry. I hope this will be borne in mind by those who wish to comment on this sensitive subject. And to those in the chamber today, it is vital that we lead by example in the tone of our discussions, not just today, but in all our words and work. It is clear from colleagues' correspondence to me that I'm not the only one hearing directly from and listening to young people and their families. Therefore, I'm sure we all agree that they must be our priority and at the heart of all our discussions about how gender identity healthcare is provided, and that everyone should be treated with respect. Presiding Officer, in my Parliamentary statement in April, I advised that a senior multidisciplinary team in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer would consider the recommendations of the NHS England commissioned CAST review and engage with relevant health boards, and that I would provide an update to Parliament. As a result of that work, the CAST review Implications for Scotland Findings report was delivered to Parliament on the 5th of July, the earliest opportunity following the pre-election period. This report is an important milestone in how we work together to deliver better gender identity healthcare for young people in Scotland. The Scottish Government has accepted the findings of the report in full, and work has started to implement its recommendations. One such recommendation is that gender identity healthcare services for young people are, and I quote, not provided in an adult sexual health setting, such as the Sandyford Clinic, but are provided within paediatric clinical settings, as with other age-appropriate services for children and young people. The report also found that to ensure sustainable services, a distributed network or regional model would be the appropriate delivery model instead of one site. We are actioning this at pace to address the immediate fragility of gender identity healthcare for young people and to develop a sustainable longer-term model. We will use the Scottish Government's new planning and commissioning approach to fragile services and are convening a senior task and finish group to take this forward. This work will be overseen by the Chief Operating Officer's Directorate within Scottish Government. Other recommendations from the report have already been implemented by NHS Scotland. For example, access to under-18s gender identity healthcare is now only through referral from a clinician. This is in line with other child or adolescent specialist services and will help ensure any other health needs can be identified and addressed. In a progress report I have published today, there is further detail on the actions taken and progress made so far. This includes the challenges around recruitment and retention of staff in these services, but also the next steps for their commissioning and provision, which will of course include the voices of service users. Presiding Officer, the CMO report and the CAST review underlined the importance of research and data. As I outlined in April, the Scottish Government commissioned Public Health Scotland in 2022 to develop a national data set for NHS gender identity clinics. The first annual data set for both adult and young people's services will be published this autumn. The Parliament is aware we have already provided the University of Glasgow with grant funding to establish a programme of research into the long-term health outcomes of people accessing gender identity healthcare. The first outputs of these projects are expected towards the end of this year. Furthermore, in August, the Chief Scientist for Health for the Scottish Government has confirmed to their counterpart in the UK Department of Health and Social Care the willingness of an NHS Scotland team, which will include the Scottish Government, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and the University of Glasgow, to join the National Institute for Health and Care Research UK-wide study on puberty-suppressing hormones as a treatment option for gender dysphoria. The CMO report also highlighted the need for national standards, as well as guidance on training and development for staff. I'm pleased that today Healthcare Improvement Scotland has published their national standards for gender identity healthcare, adults and young people. These have been developed following an extensive public consultation, as well as targeted consultation with people with lived experience, clinicians and a wide range of professional bodies. They will support clinical services and health boards to deliver positive changes in partnership with people using the services. NHS Education for Scotland's Transgender Care Knowledge and Skills Framework has also been published today. It sets out what NHS staff need to know about to care for trans and non-binary people and to improve training in this area. This framework has also been created following consultation and engagement. Further development of this framework, focusing on staff working with children and young people, has started and is expected to be completed in 2025. Presiding Officer, I have been clear that to get this right, engagement with those involved in services, whether a user or clinician, is vital. Throughout this process, the NHS has engaged constructively with people with lived experience to ensure their voices are represented. And I have regularly and proactively done the same. As well as regularly meeting with young people since becoming a minister last year, later this month I will meet a wide range of stakeholders representing those impacted by ongoing efforts within NHS Scotland to embed better service delivery and ultimately reduce waiting times. I know colleagues across this chamber are doing the same, actively engaged with young people on this topic and committed to making sure their voices are heard. Presiding Officer, I want to reiterate the Scottish Government's wider commitment to improve gender identity healthcare in Scotland for young people and adults. Since December 2022, the Scottish Government has invested over £4.4 million to support gender identity healthcare improvement. Over £3.6 million of this is being allocated directly to NHS boards, providing gender identity clinics to support them to improve service delivery. Independent evaluation of the impact of that investment on waiting times and quality of care is underway. A report will be published this winter and its findings used to support future improvements. We all want to see improvement in waiting times to access these services, and I hope the breadth of work underway and published today illustrates our commitment to improve clinical services and support to the young people who need to access them, and shows that much has been advanced since my last update to this chamber. The CAST review and the CMO implications for Scotland findings report both recognise that the wider societal discussion about gender identity is complex. They recognise too that the significant public, media and political interest in gender identity healthcare provision for young people may detract from the primary issue of providing the best clinical care necessary for them. This underlines the need for the development of young people's services to, and I quote from the CMO's report, take place with children, young people and their families in an active process of co-production. We all have a responsibility to make sure that children and young people grow up safe, respected and supported. I hope that sentiment is one we can all keep in mind today and in the future.
Thank you. The Minister will now take questions on the issues arising from her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes, after which we'll need to move on to the next item of business. For those members wishing to ask a question that haven't already done so, I'd encourage them to press the request to speak buttons and call first Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and to the Minister for advance sight of her statement. Tone and language are important when talking about gender identity healthcare, and I echo calls for MSPs to lead by example today. The Minister will be aware that I have held events in Parliament alongside families impacted by gender care. Their stories are harrowing, each outlining the importance of the evidence-based CAST Review Commission. But families and young people have had to wait weeks for a response from the Scottish Government following the Chief Medical Officer's recommendations due to parliamentary recess. During this time, MSPs have not been able to ask direct questions on behalf of their constituents, and I do hope that this is reflected upon. The Cash Review concluded that evidence is lacking to support the use of puberty-suppressing hormones, but it also details that children and young people might not be offered the right psychological support and assessments when experiencing gender distress. Puberty-suppressing hormones have been paused in Scotland, and according to the Cabinet Secretary's statement, a UK-wide study is now underway to assess it as a treatment option. So, can I ask the Minister whether puberty-suppressing hormones will continue to be paused here in Scotland until the study has concluded?
Minister.
I thank Megan Gallagher for her question and also the tone of it, and agree wholeheartedly that it's important as we as elected politicians make sure we get our tone correct. And I thank you for meeting with those families impacted. With regard to me giving this statement, I've given it on the first day that we're back in Parliament. We launched or published the Chief Medical Officer's report as soon as we could after the pre-election period. I think your direct question regarding puberty blockers, as you will know, that is a reserve power to the UK Government, and we are currently in line with that. And we wait to see what the decisions made by the UK Government. That is MHRA, which is a reserved power, and we will follow that.
Jackie Bailey.
And I thank the Minister for early sight of her statement, and also thank the Chief Medical Officer and his team for their work on the Cash Review Implications for Scotland report. I want to explore waiting times and support for staff. The decision to stop self-referrals and have GPs and other clinicians refer their patients to gender identity clinics has already been announced by the Scottish Government. So can the Minister say what additional resources, such as support and training, will be provided for GPs in what is a very sensitive area of healthcare? Secondly, the waiting times at the Sandyford are long, 4 years if you're a teenager, 5 years if you're an adult. We supported the Scottish Government's Strategic Action Framework 3 years ago when Humza Yousaf was the Health Secretary, but waiting times have continued to rise. I am told there's a recruitment problem at the Sandyford because the environment is toxic, but the position appears to be better at the Chalmers Clinic in Edinburgh. Does the Cabinet Secretary therefore believe that a national service is perhaps the answer to resolve the lack of staff and the increase in waiting times?
Minister.
I thank Jackie Bailey for her question, and as I highlighted in my statement, I do find the waiting times concerning, which is why we have invested additional funding. I talked about the 4.4 million, 3.6 of that going directly. You're right to highlight the differences between the two centres, and I think I also highlighted in my report that there is going to be a review of that funding to see where successes have been made and what the two organisations, the two health boards can learn from each other. You're also correct to highlight the recruitment issue. That's not just in Scotland, that's UK-wide. And I think, again, leaning back to Megan Gallagher's comment as well, the onus is on us to make sure that we reduce the temperature in these discussions to ensure that the right people with the right training and the right want to ensure that this service works can be recruited and, importantly, retained.
Thank you. To the surprise of nobody, there's an awful lot of interest in this subject, so I'd be grateful for brief questions and brief responses, and all responses should be through the Chair. First, Claire Haughey, to be followed by Tess White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I refer members to my register of interests. I hold a bank nurse contract with Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS. As the CAST report stated, a compassionate and kind society remembers there are real children, young people, families, carers and clinicians behind the headlines. And with that in mind, and the long waits that both adults and young people face to access gender identity services, can the Minister advise me what steps the Scottish Government are taking to recruit the staff required to reduce the waiting times?
Minister.
Claire Haughey for her question. As I responded to Jackie Bailey, since December 2022 we've provided over 4.4 million for gender identity healthcare improvement, including over 3.6 million to health boards providing gender identity clinics. But both the CAS review and the CMO report highlight recruitment in this field is challenging, and as I said in my statement, consideration of staff skills will form part of the already outlined commissioning approach to fragile services, with gender identity healthcare for children and young people now part of that.
Tess White, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
The Royal College of General Practitioners is clear that the prescribing of gender-affirming hormones should generally only be done by specialists, and yet this is often done by GPs who have shared their concerns with me about safe prescribing to patients with gender dysphoria. Under the new standards, can the Scottish Government confirm whether GPs will be routinely expected to prescribe gender-affirming hormones and whether shared care protocols will be put in place?
Minister.
I thank Tess White for her question, and I think we've been clear in our responses that it is the specialist centres that will be in charge of determining the support that children and young people need in this area. We have to ensure we have safe prescribing, which is what the outline and the regulations are creating.
Emma Roddick, to be followed by Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure the Minister, like me, receives a lot of correspondence from concerned young people and their parents each time that there's news about trans healthcare and puberty blockers and hormones in particular, due to the significant misinformation and misinterpretation of announcements. What the implementation of these recommendations means for people getting treatment will need to be extremely clear and accessible. So can she please provide reassurance to those who are currently receiving treatment or on a waiting list for treatment about the continuation of their care while this research and data collection goes on, and speak to access for such care for those in rural and island communities?
Minister.
I thank Emma Roddick for her question, and we were clear when the announcement was made about the pausing of the prescribing of puberty blockers that those on treatment would remain on that treatment. And representing a rural constituency like Ms Roddick, I absolutely understand what the reasons behind her questions. We are absolutely clear that new national standards are that services should take into account barriers people may face, including those living in island or rural communities. I agree with the multidisciplinary team's report, which states that these services should be delivered according to the principle as local as possible and as national as necessary.
Carol Mochan, to be followed by Fergus Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Minister for today's statement? There is clear disparity in availability of services based on where you live. To ensure sustainable services, there is expectation that gender identity healthcare will be provided in a number of different settings. The report refers to a distributed network or regional model. The Minister's statement says this is being actioned at pace. Can the Minister be clearer on these models and on the timescale in regard to these models?
Minister.
As I responded to Ms Roddick, it is absolutely clear that arrangements should be in place that are suitable for people wherever we live in Scotland. As I said, I represent a rural constituency. We need to ensure that people can access the right care for them at the right time, and this may include the use of digital tools to support people's access to services. If Ms Mochan would allow me, I will come back with a time frame after this question session.
Fergus Ewing, to be followed by Gillian Mackay.
Presiding Officer, Dr Hilary Cass in her report showed that social transitioning in schools does set some children on a pathway to irreversible medical interventions. Surely children being taught in schools that they're born in the wrong body are being failed in the duty of safeguarding which is owed to each of them. Will the Minister therefore, as numerous of my constituents have called for, withdraw the current guidance, remove all gender ideology references from the Relationship, Sexual Health and Parenthood resource, and finally remove third sector activist groups from schools?
Minister.
I thank Fergus Ewing for his question, and if I may just underline that my statement today is focused on NHS gender identity healthcare for young people. These are specialist services provided to a small number of young people who need their care. Children and young people are not taught about their own gender identity in schools. That is a personal matter for any individual, and in the case of young people, their family. However, it is the role of a school to provide pastoral support to a young person who is seeking it. Our education system must support everyone to reach their full potential, and it is vital the curriculum is as diverse as the young people who learn in our schools. It's also vital that we help instil the values of respect and tolerance in our children and young people.
Gillian Mackay, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. The current media and political environment means that many young trans people are terrified like never before to come out. Compound that with long waiting times for care and now not being able to access treatment they could this time last year, it's no wonder that many of these young people need mental health support, and I'm glad that this is reflected in the documents that were sent alongside the statement. However, I believe there is a danger with the approach that's currently being proposed, that trans healthcare is seen purely through that lens and that stigma is compounded on one of the most stigmatised groups in society. So how will the Scottish Government ensure that this does not happen, that stigma and transphobia is challenged at every turn, and that this Government is committed to ensuring that their healthcare is accessible and that their rights are upheld?
Minister.
I thank Ms Mackay for her question. As I have said in my statement, all the conversations that I have had in leading up to this have very much included and put the young people and their families at the centre of it. I have a meeting in the next couple of weeks to ensure that the way that we are moving forward is correct. And I think I've said this before, but I will repeat it again. There is a responsibility on those of us that are elected, our newscasters, to ensure that that toxic environment is not kept on.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following on from my colleague's question, the narrative which surrounds the conversation of gender identity healthcare must move away from the harmful, toxic state in which it currently sits. Can the Minister outline work that the Scottish Government will undertake to ensure that the young people at the heart of this discussion are supported positively, both in and out of healthcare environments?
Minister.
I thank Rona Mackay for her question, and as is set out in the progress report published today, a range of support has been put in place for young people accessing and waiting to access gender identity healthcare. This includes waiting list validation and onward referral to additional services where appropriate, as well as community-based third sector support to help address social isolation, inactivity and mental and emotional wellbeing support.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for the tone the Minister has adopted today, and I think she and I share the ambition to get this right in a timely manner and to remove some of the attendant heat that follows it. Emma Roddick rightly referenced the children at the heart of this, many of whom will have care pathways paused, who will have spent several months in profound anxiety about their future. I was very gratified to hear that the Government is still seeking an evidential base, and that part of that will be the lived experience of those who have received gender-affirming care. Can I ask what efforts her Government will use or deploy to get the voices of those children who are on waiting lists at the heart of those considerations?
Minister.
I thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for his question. I've already indicated that I meet regularly, as do my officials working with me. I think it's also important to recognise, though, that the Scottish Government has also commissioned research through Glasgow University, and part of that research is looking at hypertension and such like in young people. So there's also the research side as well. That's incredibly important to hear the voices of those that we need to hear from.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what the Scottish Government's statement mean for the future of the Sandyford Clinic? Will it be closed? Will it be relocated? And can she share a timeline for these changes? Could she also confirm if GPs were consulted in the NHS's Education for Scotland Transgender Care Knowledge Skills Framework?
Minister.
Thank Rachel Hamilton for her question. The Sandyford Gender Identity Clinic, the Sandyford Clinic is not going to be closed, as it offers a wide range of sexual health services. However, the report of the multidisciplinary team has recommended that in future specialist gender identity health services for young people are not provided in an adult sexual health setting, but paediatric clinical settings. And as I referenced in my statement, the Scottish Government's new planning and commissioning approach to fragile services work will take place to address the immediate fragility of gender identity healthcare for young people and develop a sustainable, longer-term model in line with the recommendation that these services are delivered in a paediatric setting. And as I indicated as well in my statement, all the reports, all the frameworks that we have published today have had consultation with appropriate people.
Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Ash Regan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Children and young people with gender dysphoria can present with a range of complex psychosocial challenges and mental health problems which can impact on their gender-related distress. Can parents and children in Scotland now be reassured, with services being provided in paediatric settings, that all issues will be explored fully in order to provide diagnosis, clinical support and interventions, medical or otherwise, which are appropriate for the age, stage and needs of the child or young person?
Minister. I thank Ruth Maguire for that very important question, and it is of the utmost importance that these services are delivered to the highest standard for the young people that use them. New national standards I have referenced include a standard, which is standard number 10, to specifically address the delivery of gender identity services for young people and outline the need for young people to have timely access to safe, high-quality and person-centred gender identity services which understand, respect and uphold their rights.
Ash Regan, to be followed by Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Adult and child patients must have healthcare appropriate to their clinically assessed medical presentation. So can the Government confirm what the milestones will be for Scotland's CAS compliance for the 32 recommendations, and what clinical evidence informed the national standards? And can the Minister confirm that GPs and primary care clinicians and health boards fully support these national standards and their funding, training and implementation, as reports that are reaching me suggest that this is not the case?
Minister.
Thank Ash Regan for her question, and a clear ask of the Chief Medical Officer and his multidisciplinary team was to review the recommendations in the CAS review to ensure that they were being properly implemented as appropriate in Scotland, and that's what I've been reporting on today. There is also the progress statement too. Clinical organisations were consulted. I'm not across the information about health boards complaining or raising issues, so perhaps Ms Regan would be happy to write to me on that, and I'm very happy to explore it.
And Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Following on from the questions that have been asked by Tess White, Fergus Ewing, Rachel Hamilton and Ash Regan, would the Minister take this opportunity to spell out the governance structure for the oversight of Scottish gender identity services? In other words, who is responsible?
Minister. So responsibility for all healthcare lies with the health boards, and the Scottish Government work with them to ensure that that is met. We have had very clear consultation across the board, including GPs, to ensure that the 4 reports that have been published today provide the right standards for Scotland to move forward with regard to gender identity healthcare.
Thank you, and can I thank all members for their cooperation. We managed to get everybody in that wanted to get in. There'll be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change. Okay, the next item of business is a statement by Fiona Hislop on Clyde and Hebrides Ferries, Provision, Service and Harbours Update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions on the issues following her statement. Therefore, there should be no interruptions or interventions. And I call on Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary. Around 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you for the opportunity to make this statement. Unfortunately, the pre-election period restrictions for the UK government election meant that this was the earliest opportunity for me to address the Chamber on these important issues, and there have been significant developments over the summer period. This update covers a wide range of issues relating to the support and provision of ferry services across the Clyde and Hebrides ferry network. I want to thank the crews, port staff and wider teams at Calmac and indeed Northlink for their work in providing ferry services across the busy summer period. This required dedication and flexibilities to deliver services to communities served by our lifeline networks. This was not without its challenges on the Clyde and Hebrides ferry network, with 2 extended periods with key vessels out of service on the Cymru and Arran service. I want to further extend my thanks to the communities on those islands for their patience, understanding and flexibility throughout the period of disruption. I can advise that the MV Caledonian Isles serving Arran is expected to return this month, providing significant additional capacity in terms of passenger and car carriings. This releases the MV Alfred to provide resilience and overhaul cover. We've extended her charter until at least February next year, when new tonnage should be delivered. We are also expecting an update on the repairs to the MV Isle of Arran from Calmac later today. I was also pleased to see the MV Loch Shira serving Cymru return to service at the start of August following repairs to her damaged ramp. The Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee received updates on the delivery schedule on the MV Glen Sannox on the 2nd of August and the MV Isle of Islay on the 8th of August. On the Glen Sannox, whilst it's regrettable that there has been further delay to the delivery of the vessel, I am pleased to confirm that the arrangements to ensure a smooth handover and entry into service are well underway. Reports from the sea trials and work to date have indicated that the vessel is performing well. We look forward to her entering service and serving the Arran community. Discussions are already underway with communities around the timetables when she initially enters service from Troon. The update on the Isle of Islay highlighted the impact of global supply chain issues, with the vessel now anticipated to be delivered towards the end of this year and enter service early in 2025. Although disappointing, there are issues beyond our control and are impacting on the wider shipping industry. CMAL indicate that the build quality is very high, and their team, along with the Calmac staff on site, are working with the shipyard to ensure a smooth handover of the vessel. We announced the launch of the procurement process for the 7 fully electric small vessels. This will enable older vessels to be replaced and cascade of some vessels to improve resilience and capacity on other routes. The initial phase of the procurement concludes in early October, and shortlisted shipyards will submit bids towards the end of the year. Work is also underway around port improvements and the power upgrades to support these vessels when they come into service from 2027. It is equally important, Presiding Officer, to ensure that our port and harbour network is fit for purpose while providing a high standard of passenger experience. Work to allow the new Islay-class vessels to berth at Kennecraig and Port Ascot are now substantially complete. The Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity recently visited these works en route to engagements on Islay. Work at Colonsay should finish in the autumn. Work on the Little Minch ports is now substantially complete. Lochmaddy and Tarbert are finished, and work is well underway on the terminal building at Uig. This major programme of works has delivered a combination of replacing life-expired infrastructure and increasing flexibility and resilience by allowing a larger range of major vessels to use these ports. This represents investment of over £100 million supported by the Scottish Government. Work to develop the final design and business case for Port Ellen is also underway. The preferred option being developed should tackle existing restrictions, with the marshalling at the port can be addressed, and allowing full benefit of the 40% uplift in capacity of the new vessels, but also represents an opportunity to incorporate drop trailer facilities for freight. On Ardrossan, I understand that all outstanding elements are being completed, and that I will receive the new business plan shortly. This includes considerations of the funding requirements and recurring lease costs, including progressing the legal respective agreements to protect the interests of government in terms of cost and ensuring a robust and resilient port can be maintained well into the future. Once I have had an opportunity to consider the new business plan, I will undertake to communicate the next steps directly with interested members and wider task force, which would be which would be reconvened as soon as possible. I can assure the Chamber that this remains a key priority for ministers. On the Chiefs contract, as I confirmed in May, whilst good progress is being made in relation to the direct award of the next Chiefs contract, it was necessary to extend the current contract by a period of up to 12 months. We have now published the public consultation response report on the Chiefs 3 contract, building on the earlier work by Angus Campbell. Transport Scotland officials visited 11 islands and held 22 public events, in addition to focused discussion with key ferry stakeholders. The formal consultation saw 434 responses received, and I want to thank those who contributed and also the groups and organisations across islands who helped set out the engagement and help officials reach communities. I assure those who contributed that these responses will help inform and shape the next Chiefs contract in a way that focuses on community needs and putting the customer's voice and experience at the heart of decision making. On the direct award due diligence work, this continues at pace, with a submission to the Competition and Markets Authority due imminently as the next key milestone in taking us to the go-no-go decision on direct award early next year. I will further update the Parliament on progress at that appropriate time. I said that there would need to be improvement and change, and one of the key mechanisms that will help drive that change is the CalMac Enhancement and Change Plan, which was published in July. This reflects feedback from communities around how they can help better influence service delivery. A key element of the plan is to enhance the number of local area managers across the network to enable decisions on services to be driven by the often distinct circumstances around different routes. There will now be 6 regions rather than 3, covering Clyde, Islay, Arran, Argyll Islands and Hebrides North and Hebrides South. This will enable greater engagement with customers and business users. These core roles should be empowered to influence decisions that impact their communities. Transport Scotland officials have also been engaging with the Ferry Community Board, along with CalMac, to design and define the key performance indicators that will be used to monitor the success of service delivery, with the lived experience of users at the heart of these. I expect to see these new measures and elements of the Enhancement and Change Plan brought in and refined across the extension period. I've also outlined that we will have the requirement for a Ferry Community Board set out as part of the new Chiefs contract. Workshops have been held with the board to help consider how its role can be further defined and strengthened to help it drive forward improvements in services and to further consider strategic issues across the CalMac network. I thank the board members for their dedicated work on supporting the development of key issues to date. I am also aware that there have been calls for greater island representation on the boards of ferry bodies. I agree, and this is also my aim. I am pleased that both CalMac and CMAL now have islanders on their board and are working hard to make sure island residents have opportunities to be involved. I will continue to stress to both bodies the necessity of ensuring the communities they serve are represented at the highest levels of the organisation. On the Islands Connectivity Plan, we have now published today the consultation report on the Islands Connectivity Plan, following a similarly expansive engagement with communities across both the Chiefs and their networks, who engaged on this important work that will help form policy for ferries and the investment in ports and vessels into the future. We're considering the feedback received and will look to make any changes to the 2 documents before formal publication as soon as possible. Presiding Officer, our focus on these issues demonstrates this Government's commitment to ferry services that are fit for the future. As well as ongoing and planned investments, we have in recent years been able to freeze fares or minimise increases. However, it would be remiss of me not to highlight the stark financial backdrop against which these plans I have outlined are set. We will continue to take forward our ambitious programme, but difficult decisions will be needed around all aspects of ferry services as these business cases come to fruition. Thank you for the opportunity to update Parliament on these important matters. I know they've been extensive and varied, but a lot has happened over recent months. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I'd invite members wishing to ask a question, who haven't already done so, to press the request to speak buttons, and I call first Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much indeed, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement. I've got to say, Presiding Officer, I was full of excitement and expectation, but once again the Cabinet Secretary has dashed my hopes that we would get some good news. We warned there could be a summer of ferries chaos, and there has been a summer of ferries chaos. Not a day goes by when we don't hear about more delays, cancellations and repairs. Islanders are long past being at their wits' end. There's little in this statement that we didn't know already, but the Cabinet Secretary managed to save the worst till last, in a doom-laden ending that would give Keir Starmer a run for his money. She warns of difficult decisions as business cases come to fruition. Now, she mentions Ardrossan, so is one of these difficult decisions about Ardrossan? Is the work on that port likely to be put on hold? And if not, when are we likely to see any progress? And finally, will she agree to a full debate on ferries in government time so that we can properly address all the issues?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I understand there have been disruption on certain services, but I would reiterate that the vast majority of ferry services have been completed, and it is a disservice to the staff of CalMac to say otherwise. I know there have been particular problems. I've addressed them firsthand in relation to the Isle of Cymru and Isle of Arran, and I've given updates on that. We know that there can be technical problems. We also know that there can also be weather issues in terms of berthing. So these things happen, but I think it is wrong to say that it has been the situation as relayed by Graham Simpson. And I would also remind him that it's not me or Keir Starmer that talked about or introduced the 9% capital cuts that are facing the Scottish Government's budget. That actually was the Conservative Party. I would like to see a change in the fiscal regime that would actually replace that capital reduction, but I'm afraid that's where it came from. Now, I'm not just saying in my own budget, but in others, there will be challenges. Having said that, can I just reiterate, I actually in my statement talked about, and I think it is good news, he was obviously the member that doesn't have an interest in ports and harbours, on the basis that I've just announced that we've invested £100 million successfully in that work. And I also talked about the announcement of £175 million of the procurement of the small vessels replacement. That also is very welcome. And on Ardrossan, I also gave the welcome news that I'm expecting the new business plan any time now, and I will convene the task force, who quite rightly are in the position, they've already been involved as individual stakeholders, to take forward that piece of work. So I know Graham Simpson is all doom and gloom, but even he should see there were elements, I think, of success and progress and commitment in the statement I've just been given.
Thank you. As with the previous statement, there's a lot of interest in asking questions. This will require responses to be a little bit briefer, but also those who've asked a question to then stop talking while the answers are being given. Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, I note the Cabinet Secretary's remarks at the end of her statement that it would be remiss of her not to highlight the stark financial backdrop against which these plans are set, and that difficult decisions will be needed around all aspects of ferry services. Is this just not a get-out clause for everything that comes before? It would be remiss of me not to remind the Cabinet Secretary of the Government's monumental overspend and failure in procuring Saxon and Rosa. Why should the passengers and staff across the public ferry network be made to pay for the financial incompetence of the Scottish Government? I also note the comments regarding the direct award of the CHFS contract. It was my understanding that this decision would be announced this summer, so can the Cabinet Secretary explain what has caused the major delay in announcing the Scottish Government's approach, leading to yet more uncertainty for staff for islanders on vital ferry services?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the first point, I would reflect that there is a situation that we have known about, that there is a capital pressures facing the Scottish Government, and that's just a reality, and I think it would be wrong not to address that. But I do think in terms of how we take things forward, it actually re-emphasises the point for value for money to be demonstrated, and that's the work particularly on the Donaldson business case that I've been very keen to see progressed. On his point about the direct award on shifts, can I gently remind the member that I did give indication to Parliament quite clearly and openly and transparently that we would be extending the current shifts to award for up to another year. I hope doesn't take that long, but we would need to do that because there are elements of what we were doing, particularly going to the CMA, also as I mentioned in my remarks about the Harbours Agreement. So that was known publicly even before recess. So the issue now is making sure that we get everything in order so that we can, as my preference, I think it's his as well, move to the direct award decision. So the Chiefs 2 extension was announced prior to recess, and what I'm saying is on the Chiefs 3 that I'm hoping that we'll be getting to the position that we can move to the progress of the go-ahead with that, to give everybody the certainty, not least the staff, that they need. But I would gently remind the member that I did set that out before recess.
I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome confirmation that the MV Caledon and Isles will soon return to service. My Arran constituents will benefit from the much-needed additional capacity and resilience, given that the Ardrossan to Brodick service has again been disrupted for the 5th day in a row. Meanwhile, redevelopment of Ardrossan Harbour drags on and on without a decision. Today, the Cabinet Secretary said it's a key priority and the Government is committed to retaining Ardrossan as a mainland port for Arran. It did so in 2017. 2017. 7 years later, not a single shovel has hit the ground, and I appreciate that business plan is on its way. But when will all this seemingly endless uncertainty finally be lifted and a decision to proceed taken?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I share the members' frustrations and that of the communities of Arran and Ardrossan. A decision can only be undertaken when the vital business casework is completed. As stated, the work continues. Significant changes to the estimated project costs, outstanding legal and lease matters have been the issues that have been addressed more recently, and that obviously in turn will impact on the partners. I'm not saying the government's, the partners' financial packages, and we've got to give them time to make sure that they have developed them. What I am saying is that I expect that business plan to be presented to me very shortly, and obviously at that point we can ensure, and that's why all the work is going in to demonstrate the business case, both in the social, the economic, but also the value for money perspective. That work is completing. I expect to see the new business plan soon, and I will, as I said, convene the task force as soon as possible after that, so we can move forward.
Jamie Green to be followed by Stewart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Before recess, my questions about the delivery of the Glen Sannox were met with nothing less than evasion. Hours after recess started, bad news was snuck out to the media. I have to say the disruption to the Isle of Arran this summer has been endless, and it's very costly to island businesses. The main Arran ferry has been out of action for most of this year. The temporary replacement vessel has been out of action now for 5 days, as others have mentioned. And the new Arran ferry, we still have yet no delivery date in today's statement. What faith can islanders have that this coming winter will be any better than the disastrous summer that they've already had?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the delivery date for Glen Sannox was communicated as appropriate to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, and indeed the date was set out as the 30th September during that communication to the committee over the summer. So therefore, what I was talking about is the delivery of that and the plans for the delivery, and that's why the sea trials that are ongoing are very important, and it's very pleasing to hear that they are going well. In terms of the issues that have faced the Caledonian Isles, that is obviously frustrating. I do know that obviously in terms of there are other ways and other means by which people can provide access in terms of the MV Alfred and also the other route. Obviously, latterly, the Isle of Arran problems have caused issues. These are technical issues. I think people want to make sure their vessels are safe, and therefore it's appropriate if there are technical problems, they are addressed. I can tell you that it's expected to have communication at 8 o'clock this evening, I understand, about a potential for tomorrow's sailings from the Isle of Arran. I know that's not satisfactory for those that have been disrupted over the last week, but I can relay the most recent information that I've been given.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Ensuring that the Glen Sannox and the Glen Rosa is clearly the immediate priority, but it's also vital that Ferguson's is supported fully to bid for future work. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise what support it's providing, not just for the funding, but also to help get the current ferries delivered, and also to set the yard up for future success?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm not providing funding for the Ferguson's yard. That is the responsibility of the Deputy First Minister, and the Deputy First Minister has set out the provision of £14 million to ensure that the yard can become as competitive and productive as possible to win future bids, which is what we want it to see. I understand also that Ferguson's have indicated that they will want to bid for the SVRP Phase 1 vessels, and that is the procurement of that is the responsibility of myself, and information about that was also set out over the summer.
Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The statement doesn't mention freight capacity at all. The building of the Western Isles interconnector will require almost all the current capacity for freight on the Loch Seaforth, while the building of new distilleries in Islay will increase freight traffic there. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how she intends to increase freight capacity, and whether ferries due to be replaced will be kept in the fleet to provide that additional capacity where and when required into the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
So actually I did refer to freight, particularly in reference to Port Ellen. She'll know that Port Ellen and Islay is one of the key ports that are used by and would want to be used by the whisky industry going forward. And I specifically talked about drop load freight capacity being considered as part of the plans for Port Ellen. So it's incorrect to say that I didn't mention freight. And of course the new capacity that will be available for increased HGVs on both the Glen Sannox, but also on the Islay. I think it's 55% on the Islay class in terms of the services to Islay will help support them. I think she raises a very good and important point in relation to the Western Isles in relation to renewable energy companies, and Transport Scotland and my officials took part in a meeting with the wider economic interests in the Council and others in terms of the economic development and the requirement for freight there. You will recall, and you'll be perfectly, so the member will be perfectly aware that CalMac is heavily subsidised by the Scottish Government. We obviously have a number of private energy companies who will be making significant profits from renewable energy. I think collectively together we can work together to identify how we can maximise the use of everybody's resources to increase freight capacity. But I do think she's raising a serious point, and I can reassure I'm taking that forward as one of the areas that I think I need to work with my colleagues both in energy and the economy on, to make sure that we have plans for the future that will meet that future capacity needs of the renewable energy interest.
Jackie Dunbar, to be followed by Ariane Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for providing today's statement. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that the Scottish Government continue to reiterate to Caledonia McBrain that it is crucial for island communities to feel that they are both kept up to date with and involved in relevant discussions regarding the lifeline services which the islands rely on?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do, and I stress the importance of establishing the Ferry Community Board as part of the Chiefs 3 contract, and indeed their role in identifying the KPIs of that contract. In addition, in terms of the enhancement and change plan that was announced by CalMac, I did say that it's not business as usual. There has to be change. Having six regions with 6 area managers would enable, I think, a more responsive and ability to respond to needs and services, but also importantly communication, because in my discussion with islanders, communications of what can be recognised as genuinely needed changes in service is also an important aspect of what that improvement can look like.
Ariane Burgess, to be followed by Bob Doris.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for her statement. It's good to hear progress being made across the CalMac network. As a Highlands and Islands MSP, I know that the performance and future of our ferries and the port are a source of deep concern and frustration. Beyond the unavoidable tidal and weather-related issues, 10 ferry routes in my region are today on restricted timetables or cancelled altogether. While I welcome the proposals for 6 local area manager posts in the CalMac Enhancement and Change Plan, and news that there are some local people already in place, can the Minister outline what has been put in place to ensure that island communities will always be embedded in the decision-making of their ferry services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there'll be different routes for that. I think the issue in terms of the KPIs will embed islanders' lived experience in relation to satisfaction within that. The whole point of having a direct award is that the delivery by CAMAP will be focused on delivering public service rather than working simply to deliver a pre-existing contract and working to contract. I also think in terms of, as I've mentioned before, the critical role of the Ferry Community Board, and I also think in terms of the representation of islanders, not as necessarily as representing any particular island, but to bring an islander perspective to that wider governance will be a requirement in relation to boards of both CalMac and CMAL.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Cabinet Secretary, clearly there's a lot of detail in your statement, and there's also clearly a pipeline of new vessels which are going to be added to the network in the near future. Does the Scottish Government have any figures regarding the net benefit of all these new vessels in terms of increased capacity on vessels and also, just as important, island communities, the network resilience?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, clearly, in terms of the capacity issues, I've referenced already, I think, in answer to another member, for the Isla routes, the two new vessels, MV Isle of Isla and MV Lochendal, will have increased capacity. They'll have 14 HGVs, each have also for deck capacity for 100 passengers. Overall, the vessels have space for 20 HGVs if you combine them, and compared to the maximum of 18 HGVs on existing vessels, that does equate to 55% more deck space for HGVs. That also will apply to the sister vessels, which will obviously have a similar capacity configuration. On the small vessel replacement programme, Phase 1, you will see the increase in capacity there equate to a 40% increase. But of course, another aspect will be in relation to reliability and resilience, with new vessels coming into the fleet, and the reliable and resilient ferry services will automatically, obviously, increase available capacity on some key routes.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnston.
There is little that generates more public anger than the scandal of the ferries, and we've had yet more of that again today. Broken age in ferries again, delayed new ferries again, and stranded islanders again. And the Cabinet Secretary has been particularly evasive today. She's been asked a number of times about what she's referring to when she's saying that cuts are coming because of the financial position. I think she's got a duty to spell out to the Chamber today exactly what she means.
Cabinet Secretary.
So, going forward, we have to ensure that the public purse can deliver on key public services. This government is focused on delivering on 4 key missions. Improving public services is one of them. As part of the transport aspect of public services, ferries are clearly one of those. But it would be wrong for me to identify that having frozen fares in the past, having minimised increases in costs in other areas, in terms of looking at all the future developments, both of ports and harbours and a number of areas, it means that we have to drive down and be harder and smarter at making sure the business cases that are presented to us for delivery get value for money, because we're doing this in a context of years of austerity. And as Shona Robison quite rightly pointed out, it was actually the Liberal Democrats, as part of the Conservative Liberal Democrat government, that heralded the start of austerity in this country.
Jamie Halker-Johnston, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
Thank you very much. The MV Alfred was first chartered in April 2023 for an initial period of 9 months at a cost of £9 million, or £1 million per month. There have now been 2 further extensions, with the latest extension scheduled to end in March 2025. That will mean the MV Alfred will have been chartered for just short of 24 months. So can the Cabinet Secretary advise me of the total cost of that charter to the taxpayer? And if she doesn't have that figure to hand, can Fiona Hislop at least confirm whether or not the total cost of this nearly 2-year charter is more or less than the reported £14.5 million cost to Pentland Ferries to buy the vessel outright in the first place?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I expect that it would. I think it is right that I, as the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, and indeed my predecessors, ensured that there was cover and resilience for our islands communities on the CHIFS network. I don't think the member is suggesting we shouldn't have done that. In terms of purchasing, we have continually looked at purchasing of vessels in order to help resilience, actually not least for freight, and as he knows very well, for freight for the NIFS network in particular. So is it satisfactory? No, it's not. As the Minister is representing the customer base, for receipt of the incoming ferries, of course I am as frustrated as others are, and also in relation to that increased cost in terms of providing that additional cover. That is frustrating, but obviously in terms of purchase, there has to be a willing seller to be able to purchase from, and at a satisfactory price. I'm not referring necessarily to the MV Alfred, but all the other vessels that we're looking at. But there are particular needs that we have, and obviously in terms of the Arran route in particular, it has proved very important and helpful in providing that cover. But I do look forward to those 6 new vessels by 2026 and the 7 new small vessels replacements that I announced in the summer are being procured, actually starting to provide that absolutely necessary resilience in the Scottish fleet.
And Emma Roddick.
Officer, I've received a lot of communication over the summer from islanders who haven't been able to make ferry journeys that were necessary. I wonder, has the Scottish Government given any thought to making contractual provision for a SAMSO-style ticketing system whereby separate allocations are maintained to ensure that islanders are given an equitable level of priority on sailings in the next CHIFS contract?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the CHIFS 2 contract included a commitment for a smart ticketing platform, but in particularly in relation to the issue of islanders and places for islanders on routes. The member may not be aware, but we're already piloting that on the current deck space reservation pilot for Mull, Coll and Tiree, and in CalMac's Enhancement and Change Plan published in July. If this pilot has delivered the intended benefit, the intention there, as announced, is to engage with communities to have a rollout of that in order islanders to have reserved places. And we know that's essential for short notice and particular pressurised immediate sailings that islanders have to have. So I can reassure the member that not only are we thinking about it, we're piloting it already, and there's a commitment to roll it out should that prove successful.
Thank you. That concludes the Ministerial Statement on Clyde and Hebrides ferries. We move on to the next item of business. I'll allow a moment for front benches to organise themselves. Thank you. Before we move on to the next item of business, I'll just take this opportunity to alert members to the fact that business is running approximately 20 minutes late. The next item of business is a statement by Jenny Gilruth on mobile phones and behaviour and relationships in school. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Jenny Gilruth. Up to 10 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to update Parliament on the Scottish Government's new guidance on mobile phones in schools and on our joint relationships and behaviour action plan with COSLA. And I know this topic is of great interest to colleagues from across the Chamber and to their constituents. When we last debated this topic back in March, I said then that all of us are striving for our schools and our classrooms to be free from violence and disruption, so that our young people can learn and our teaching staff can work safely. And in recognition of this shared aspiration. In April, I held a very constructive meeting with education spokespeople from opposition parties to discuss our work on relationships and behaviour and to provide them with the opportunity to feed in their priorities to the action plan. Presiding Officer, I want to begin by reminding colleagues of the key findings from the Behaviour in Scottish Schools research, which we published in November of last year. This was externally commissioned research from almost 4,000 school staff from all across Scotland, and the research provides a nationally representative picture of what is happening in our schools. And while, of course, there will be local variations, it provides robust evidence upon which to base the action plan and the guidance on mobile phones. And what BISR shows, and is a key point that we shouldn't lose sight of, is that most children and young people are generally well behaved in class and around school. But I accept this research, as well as the evidence gathered by our teaching unions and through the series of relationships and behaviour summits I chaired last year, also tells us that behaviour is absolutely not where it should be, and that post-pandemic things have become much more challenging in our classrooms for a range of different reasons. With this in mind, I wish to begin with the development of the refreshed guidance on mobile phone use. Recently, I've been reading The Anxious Generation by social psychologist Donaldson, which highlights the broad impact that increased access to smartphones, screens and social media is having on young people. The impacts that he highlights, such as mental health, addiction and sleep deprivation, are all factors which impact on young people's readiness to learn. And it is clear from BISR, but also from PISA, that mobile phones are having a substantial impact in our classrooms, disrupting learning and often causing conflict. When I launched the mobile phone guidance at Stonelaw High School in Rutherglen last month, I heard directly from pupils and staff about the impact mobile phones were having on their day-to-day classroom experience. Before the summer, nearly 700 pupils monitored and mined their own screen time during one period of PSE. Some of their teachers also took part in this exercise, and both pupils and teachers alike were shocked by the results. On average, every pupil received 18 notifications during that 1 hour lesson. Multiply that by the number of pupils in a class and you can see how much disruption that causes to pupils' concentration. Members will know that I do not currently have the power to ban mobile phones as Cabinet Secretary. However, the updated national guidance goes as far towards a national ban as I am currently able to by setting out the Government's clear support for whole school bans. Our head teachers are empowered to take the steps that they consider appropriate to create an environment free from disruption caused by mobile phones, an environment where they are better able to focus on their learning, to actively listen to one another, and one that supports positive relationships between peers and with staff too. And if that environment is best created by banning phones in the entirety of the school estate, indeed for the entirety of the school day, then the guidance will support that action. Head teachers know their schools best, and the guidance provides them with the flexibility that works for them and their local context. At Stonelaw, for example, following engagement with pupils, parents and staff, the school has prohibited mobile phones in learning and teaching areas during learning and teaching time. This protects the learning environment whilst also respecting children and young people's personal time at breaks. Speaking to the staff and pupils, they appreciated the school taking this balanced approach. They spoke about the trust placed in them through allowing continued use of mobile phones in certain areas and at certain times. And the privilege given to them by their teachers was not something that they wanted to abuse. Fundamentally, though, they realise and recognise that for them a successful approach required a bit of give and take, and adopting a collaborative approach helped everyone approach the changes positively. I turn now to the Joint Action Plan on Relationships and Behaviour, which I also launched during my visit to Stonelaw High School. And I want to reiterate, as I've done every time that I've spoken on this topic in the Chamber, that our schools should be safe and consistent learning environments for all pupils and staff. But what has been clear from the engagement I have taken over the last year is that relationships and behaviour in our schools have changed since the pandemic. And while discussions in this chamber have often focused on increases in violence and aggression, we've also heard about the challenges being much more wide-ranging and complex. Schools are dealing with a wide variety of challenges that they just would not have been facing 5 or even 10 years ago. Those include children and young people who are much less mature than they would expect, with difficulties communicating their emotions and navigating social dynamics. Many are struggling with their mental health, exacerbated by the pandemic and also the stress associated with the cost of living crisis. The rise of right-wing influencers having an impact on the prevalence of misogyny towards pupils and staff. And as I have said, the prevalence of mobile phone use disrupting learning and teaching. The Behaviour Action Plan is therefore ambitious in responding to this very wide variety of concerns. It contains 20 overarching actions under 8 themes that we will take forward over the next 3 years. These actions address not only violence, but the breadth of areas identified as being priorities, and those include consequences, recording and monitoring, children and young people's well-being, attendance, and empowering staff to reinforce positive relationships and behaviour. The plan balances setting clear national direction through the provision of guidance and developing capacity through enhanced practical guidance and support for local authorities and schools delivered by organisations such as Education Scotland. And importantly, the plan is jointly owned by COSLA, given that the statutory responsibility for the delivery of education rests with our councils. The plan has been developed in collaboration with the Scottish Advisory Group for Relationships and Behaviour in Schools, which includes COSLA, ADES, Education Scotland, the EIS, NASUWT, the SSTA, Association of Heads and Deputies Scotland, School Leaders Scotland, Unison, the Deans of Education, educational psychologists, Respects Me and parents' representatives. And the value of the plan being developed by Sagrabus and all the partners I've just mentioned is that all of those partners have a role in implementing the plan. They have helped also to help shape the priorities and actions that are contained within it. Now, Sagrabus will monitor the implementation of the plan over the next 3 years, and they will adjust as necessary in light of any emerging issues, including those brought to us by the teaching profession. Now, I want to acknowledge the frustration some colleagues have felt about how long it took to publish the action plan. I had intended, of course, to publish before the summer, but having considered the advice on activity during the UK Parliament pre-election period, I took the decision to launch as soon as possible in the new school term. And I want to provide reassurance to colleagues that while we have been developing the plan, we've also continued to implement action to support schools and their staff. The new mobile guidance is an example of this, but it does not stand on its own. Rather, it supplements a suite of support announced since last November, including new funding for training of support staff in direct response to the findings of the research from BISR that staff would welcome such training, new guidance on preventing and responding to gender-based violence in schools to address emerging trends surrounding misogyny, additional data and support to help improve attendance, including guidance, professional learning, networking and exemplification launched by Education Scotland only last week, and support spearheaded by our new Chief Interim Inspector to ensure that HMI inspections help to support improvement. Now, that progress that I've set out today is not the end of the journey. We will continue to focus and to bring forward actions over the coming weeks and months. This includes the publication later this year of refreshed guidance on anti-bullying, work on consequences and additional information to enhance the understanding of S4 leaders, which has also been published this morning. Presiding Officer, the development of the Mobile Guidance and Action Plan were a collaborative effort involving many stakeholders, not just in Sagrabus, but all of those who participated in the BISR research, in the Relationships and Behaviour Summits, or who have spoken to me about their experiences in the classroom or supporting their child. I want to thank all of those who have shared their experiences with us to inform this important work. And I recognise that there are unlikely to be quick, easy fixes to addressing these challenges. Neither can nor should they be addressed by schools alone. It will take sustained effort by everyone who has a role to play to improve the situation. The willingness of all to have constructive conversations about the scale of the challenge and of the actions that are needed means I am confident that this shared commitment exists. Presiding Officer, in this spirit, I very much hope that all of us across the Chamber can support the plan and the trajectory it puts in place to improve relationships and behaviour in Scotland's schools for the benefit of our children and young people, teaching staff and our whole school communities. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. I'd be grateful if those who wish to put a question to the Cabinet Secretary were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the advanced sight of the statement. But like the guidance on mobile phones and the behaviour action plan, this statement is long on words and very short on detail. To be fair, the Cabinet Secretary acknowledges that the Behaviour Action Plan has taken far too long to produce, from when the Scottish Conservatives first demanded it in spring 2023, through the various groups that opposition spokespersons were excluded from, and then the delay this summer. But she fails to mention that the EIS said, without the necessary allocation of funding and resources, the plan will become little but a wish list and a real wasted opportunity. Perhaps most worryingly, this statement and the plan provided little clarity on how it will be implemented, when and how. So, Cabinet Secretary, 3 questions, please. What does your planning tell you constitutes the necessary allocation of funding and resources, and will councils and schools be given them? For the outcomes set out under Theme 7, tracking impact and progress, when precisely will those things be done? And finally, when will the Cabinet Secretary provide clarity on the range of approaches and consequences that are available, including exclusion, where there is no appropriate alternative?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Kerr for his questions. There's quite a few different areas he covers. I'll try to respond to each in turn. First of all, I'd like to pick up a favourite topic of Mr Kerr's and of others in the Chamber, which relates to opposition spokespeople not being invited to a series of meetings that I held with the teaching profession and others who work in education. I make no apologies for that, Presiding Officer. It was really important that a safe space was created for teaching staff to share their experiences of what had happened in schools, and I don't think having other politicians in the room would have been helpful to that end. However, he also knows that I am a collegiate Cabinet Secretary and I engage with him regularly on a range of different educational matters, which is exactly why I met with the opposition prior to the election to talk about our plans in this space. And I think, actually, Presiding Officer, broadly, particularly in relation to behaviour in schools, we have seen quite good party consensus on it. We'll maybe hear more of that in the future questions that will no doubt follow. In relation to the specifics, he asks about, I think, consequences, and he also asks about exclusion. So, for his understanding, new anti-bullying guidance is going to publish by the end of this year. We did publish, actually, on Friday, Education Scotland published updated attendance guidance. I would also draw his attention to an infographic that Scottish Government has published today, which specifically looks at S4 leaver data. And he knows I'm very concerned about our S4s at the current time and leaver trajectories, particularly in relation to positive destinations, but also in relation to behaviour and their attendance levels. The third point I think he raised related to consequences. Again, that will publish as part of the action plan by March of next year. We're working with the Head Teachers Task Force that I established last year to develop that further. He mentioned exclusion. Again, that will feature in the update on the action plan in March. And there are further practical examples that I can give him in relation to the guidance that is published today, not least, I think, Presiding Officer, the mobile phone guidance. He made a point in relation to the EIS and also on resources, and of course the EIS were part of Sagrabis in formulating the guidance and have broadly, I think, welcomed. I recognise the point Mr Kerr puts on resources. He also recognises that this year the Scottish Government is investing record levels in our education system, and if he wants me to invest more, then I have to ask him from where that would come, because at the current time, we have an incoming Labour Government
Secretary
who seems to be mirroring the spending decisions of the outgoing Conservative Government. That is going to impact on the resources I have at my disposal as Cabinet Secretary, but I'm sure he would be keen to work with me on this in relation to ensuring we have that additionality from the new UK Government to ensure this is adequately resourced.
Duncan Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary both for bringing this issue to the Chamber today and for advanced sight of her statement. The publication of this guidance, whilst long overdue, is welcome. But I do worry too that the devil will be in the detail of how it is implemented, because, as the General Secretary of the EIS said, as we've heard, implementation of the national guidance will indeed need resources. So I come today with a potential solution for the Cabinet Secretary. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary then, instead of the planned redirecting of RICS funding to the Government's Centre for Teacher Excellence, which most in the sector don't think is needed, indeed the EIS said at the time it would not address challenges the Cabinet Secretary has set out today and recognised in her statement, does she agree with me that the RICS money could be better spent by giving it to schools to support the implementation of the approach set out in the Behaviour in Schools plan?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for her question, and I'm glad that she also welcomes the publication of the plan. I think she is correct to say the devil will be in the detail. One of the things I was very mindful of in the development of the guidance was that it's not for government sometimes to instruct schools in relation to how they implement behaviour plans. I think we do need to trust Scotland's teaching profession. I see the member nodding in agreement. And when I visited Stonelaw High School 2 weeks ago now to launch the guidance, I spoke to the head teacher in that school about how she was implementing a mobile phone ban. She's taken a much more nuanced approach than the school I previously taught in Edinburgh, where there is, as I understand it, a more whole school ban approach. But she's taken that approach by getting the buy-in from her staff and from her pupils. And I was really struck by the way in which she'd allowed that devil in the detail, I suppose, to come into fruition in her school community. But she's also used, I think, some of the real founding principles that the National Action Plan sets out. And one of the points that was raised with me by head teachers at the Behaviour Summits was the need for government at national level to set out a clear expectation around about this issue. And that's what I've been keen to do throughout this process. She asked a question about the RICS and about the Centre for Teaching Excellence. I think it's important we don't pit funding to support the profession against funding that's needed to respond to changes in behaviour. And so I suppose my point back to her is I don't want to take funding away from supporting the teaching profession. I think actually excellent learning and teaching is really important. But I want additionality. So I know, well, I can hear the member shouting when, I think, from a sedentary position. I don't yet have clarity on the VAT that the Labour government has told us is going to flow to government from private schools. And I also don't have clarity on the 6,500 extra teachers that the Labour Party promised the rest of the UK. I presume I'm going to get consequentials. Perhaps if I had some certainty on both of those funding streams, I could give additionality to behaviour in Scotland schools.
I call Elena Whittam to be followed by Ros McCall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that some pupils will have unique personal circumstances that will require their phones. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore say more about how the published guidance gives considerations to those pupils, such as our young carers, those with neurodiversities, mental health struggles or medical conditions, and who may need exemptions from school-wide mobile phone policies? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member raises a really important point, and I think it also relates to the response I gave to Pam Duncan-Glancy. It's important we don't have a monolithic national approach to this, and the guidance makes clear that when developing or refreshing school guidance, there is a need for schools to look at a range of individual circumstances that might apply, and the member has given a range of different examples of those, and I know from my previous experience in the classroom there may be a need for some young people to have that contact, the need to monitor medication, the need for young carers, for example, to remain in touch with family members for their care, and also that in some cases mobile phones might be a source of support for some pupils with additional support needs. Those matters will, of course, be known to school communities and do need a tailored response. That's why I think it's hugely important that we trust our head teachers to get the implementation of this policy right, and that might look different in different schools, which is exactly why the points the member has raised today in relation to pupils and their needs is so important.
Ros McCall to be followed by Claire Hawley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I note the Scottish Government has given support for whole school bans by empowering head teachers to take the steps that they consider appropriate. And I entirely agree with the statement that head teachers know their schools best. So can the Cabinet Secretary explain why the Scottish Government is so reluctant to give head teachers even greater autonomy so they can take whatever steps they believe is required to not only improve behaviour but to raise attainment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the member raises an important point, and I also should pay tribute, Presiding Officer, to the member's interest on this issue. We've met on this, and she's written to me and corresponded on a number of occasions, particularly in relation to challenges in our own region. I think in terms of head teachers' autonomy, we've always pursued, as a government, a policy approach that seeks to empower the teaching profession, but particularly head teachers in Scotland schools. And one of the ways in which we've been able to exemplify that, of course, is through the funding of the Scottish Attainment Challenge, which flows directly to head teachers and empowers them them to take decisions about additional funding in their schools and where that's best placed. So I think that's evidence of us trusting Scotland's head teachers in practice. I think more broadly to the member's suggestion about empowering them further, I am amenable to that. Of course, I need to work with COSLA, recognising their responsibilities, but I am amenable to that because I do trust our head teachers. And I think post-pandemic, we perhaps need to revisit that empowerment agenda, one on which I think we probably both agree.
Haughey, to be followed by Martin Whitfield.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As referenced in her statement last month, the Cabinet Secretary visited Stonelaw High in my Rutherglen constituency, where they have developed their new mobile phone policy following a process of engagement and discussion with young people. Would you agree with me that similar approaches will be key to ensuring young people feel a shared ownership of their school's policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
I just put on the record, Presiding Officer, given that Stonelaw High School is in Clare Haughey's constituency, that it is an outstanding school with an outstanding head teacher and some outstanding young people, and I was delighted to meet with them 2 weeks ago to launch the mobile phone guidance, but also really importantly to talk to them about their experiences of how they've been engaged in policy development and how they felt ownership over it, not that it was something being done to them, which I think is hugely important. Stonelaw High School, of course, gives us an example of how that engagement through the curriculum has really generated an understanding of the impact of phones on learning, and that has really helped to build cooperation with the policy, not just with young people, but also with their parents and the wider community. And I know from initial feedback from pupils, but also from staff, that it's working and that young people and staff alike feel an ownership over the policy itself. It's certainly an example I would support other schools in perhaps following.
Martin Whitfield, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer. The Government published the Education Outcome for Looked After Children 22-23 report. This shows that care-experienced pupils face significant challenges in achieving academic success compared to their peers. These are some of the young people who are most at risk in the environment that today's statement deals with. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm the Government have details of the risk profile of this group, and how will these young people feed into the guidance, and how will they be included as looked after children, which is their right when this guidance is created?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. He raises a hugely important point. Of course, the risk profile would be something that was owned by the local authority, not by central government, who would have the data on their individual pupils, their cohort, and they would know and understand which of their pupils were care experienced. I would expect head teachers in schools then to consider that in the application of the policy, which is why I think to one of the previous members' questions, I would expect head teachers to work with their cohort on that risk profile and to address and support accordingly pupils who may need access to a mobile phone throughout the school day. But he does raise an important point, and it is worthwhile reminding the Chamber additionally that through the Scottish Attainment Challenge there is a specific funding stream which supports looked after children and care experienced young people, and through, for example, mechanisms such as the Virtual Head Teachers Network, we've been able to support care experienced young people and get them back into school where perhaps in the past they may have not been able to engage for a variety of different reasons. So we will always work with local authorities to that end. I've set out some of the examples at national level, but in terms of the risk profile, the data set does belong to local authorities and the legislation sets out the statutory responsibility does rest with them.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Digital technology can provide another platform for bullying, harassment and abuse, and it's vital we keep working to make sure staff and pupils are safe. Can the Cabinet Secretary speak to how, alongside the Equally Safe in Schools programme, the guidance feeds into the promotion of positive relationships and anti-bullying policies?
Cabinet Secretary.
For her question, I think in terms of developing positive relationships, it's really fundamental that we recall that the type of behaviour and relationships approaches that are probably used in Scotland's schools now are not those which most members in this chamber would have experienced 20+ years ago. So we've moved away from what I would argue was a relatively punitive approach to behaviour previously to one which is much more supportive. And undoubtedly, throughout the course of the past year, we've heard in the chamber examples of where that has created tension. I think the National Action Plan is really important in setting out expectations around about behaviour, but also expectations in terms of where we go next. So to Mr Kerr's point in relation to consequences, in relation to recording and monitoring, all of this needs to be developed in line with the teaching profession, but also in line with our pupils and our young people as well, with their interests at heart.
Greer, to be followed by George Adam.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary knows I try not to be cynical, but I'm struggling to understand the purpose of this mobile phone guidance. It's 10 pages that could be summarised in a single line. You, schools, have the same power to restrict mobile phones that you've always had. Given the Cabinet Secretary is well aware of the quite rightful cynicism that so many teachers feel about huge amounts of guidance being produced by Government and by Education Scotland, and little, if anything, ever actually changing, could she tell me what the additional value of this guidance is when nothing has actually changed in terms of what schools can or cannot do?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I note Mr Greer's cynicism, and he will know as a former secondary teacher I share it generally. However, and I also should say that he received a small clap from Liam Kerr when he made that point. I'm not sure if he was... Oh, apologies. But I think to the substance, this is not another example of guidance that's not going to have an impact, because it's a plan, it's a 3-year plan, and it will be monitored, and that's quite different perhaps from other guidance that has published previously. It will be monitored, it will be published, and that will be shared, of course, with the Education Committee, who I know are taking a very keen interest in this. And the final point I would make is this advice and guidance hasn't come from thin air. It has come at the behest of the profession, who asked me as Cabinet Secretary for a clearer direction on behaviour, who were very clear that things had changed post-pandemic, and they were asking for that clear guidance from central government on expectations around about behaviour and relationships. I think we've responded to that call through the National Action Plan. As I intimated in my statement, this is not the end of the road. It is part of a process. I've set out a range of measures we have already taken in the past year, but the Action Plan will report on every year for the next 3 years, and I think that will be the marker of progress.
George Adam, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm supportive of these moves, and please correct me if I'm oversimplifying this, Cabinet Secretary, but is it not the case that the most important aspect of this is that head teachers know their schools best, and empowering teachers to take these steps, the best fit for their learning environments, is surely the correct approach to take? And can the Cabinet Secretary provide examples of how the latest guidance will support schools to make the best choices for their pupils?
Secretary.
Well, I agree with Mr Adam, and I think I've mentioned this previously. Fundamentally, the guidance sets out our expectation that as a government we trust Scotland's head teachers to deliver improved behaviour and relationships in our classrooms, and I think the guidance goes some way to supporting that. It also recognises and respects the role of head teachers, and that perhaps contrasts with the approach that has been taken in other parts of the UK, where the government has decided on a national ban. I think it's far better in education to work with the professionals we entrust who work in our classrooms on a daily basis. And I've been clear that the decision on whether or not to introduce bans on mobile phones is entirely one for head teachers. But of course, if they should choose to do so, they will have my full support. The member asked about an example, and of course I've spoken at length today regarding Stonelaw High School's approach. That approach has only been possible because of the leadership taken by the head teacher in that school to support her staff, to support her young people, and to engage with the wider community. It's an example of good practice, and of course other head teachers, I'm sure, will take their own approaches to this. But the fundamental point is this: the Scottish Government trusts Scotland's head teachers to enact a ban should they see fit.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Sue Webber.
I want to give credit to the Cabinet Secretary for the focus that she's given on the behaviour issues. I think she gets the problem. And it's good to have a new action plan. But I can't fundamentally see what's new. We've got lots of guidance, lots of documents, lots of action plans. It's going to be monitored. But I'm not sure exactly what is going to be monitored. What fundamentally has changed? Because there's lots of teachers I've spoken to, and they're completely oblivious to this guidance. They've not read the action plan, they've not seen it. So can the Cabinet Secretary take the opportunity now to set out concisely what's different?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Rennie, for his question. He asked what is going to be monitored, and of course the action plan is going to be monitored over the course of the next year. But let me give an example of some of the things that are in the action plan. So, for example, one of the points that we've discussed at length relates to consequences. There are a range of different measures you can take in relation to consequences in school, and in fact Mr Rennie and I and others discussed this very recently. It's important that the action plan identifies what acceptable consequences look like. That will be a clear-cut example of something that's different. It's not something that government has specified before. The other ask that came to government from the profession and from parents and from young people was the definition of violence. I think we perhaps discussed this previously too. The action plan will set that out. That's never been set out by government before. I think it is important. The further work I think I talked to related to the work that Education Scotland's undertaken, that published on Friday in relation to S4 leaver data. I think that's really important too. And on attendance more generally, where we know there are real challenges post-pandemic, particularly in relation to certain year groups. But the action plan itself is going to be monitored by Sagrabus, not just by central government. We will be held to account by the actions in that plan. And of course, the action plan has been published. I'm sorry to hear that Mr Rennie's constituents haven't engaged with it, but I'm sure as a constituency MSP he could help to furnish them with a copy of the action plan and to share it widely, because it's hugely important that the profession is engaged with this. And of course, the action plan itself came from the profession. They were part of creating it in co-production with Scottish Government and with Scotland's teaching unions.
Sue Webber, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you. Leadership is about taking bold and courageous decisions, Cabinet Secretary. Alongside teaching groups and experts like Lindsay Patterson, I've been calling on a ban on mobile phones in classrooms for quite some time now. Can you confirm today that the approach in your action plan will empower our schools and head teachers to take the necessary action to do this, or are we, in the words of Lindsay Patterson, leaving it up to schools to argue out with resentful adolescents and stroppy parents?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, it will empower head teachers to undertake a mobile phone ban. Many schools already have one. I actually read, I think, a piece in one of the newspapers in relation to Mr Patterson's views on this. I'm slightly concerned that he maybe doesn't understand the limitations of my powers as Cabinet Secretary. I cannot enforce a national ban. I do not have that power. However, local authorities do, who run our schools. That's why I trust Scotland's head teachers to get it right in their schools. And actually, I support Scotland's head teachers in taking the right decisions for the young people in their care. I'm not sure if Mr Patterson disagrees with that statement, but I don't.
And Ruth Maguire.
Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary mentioned in her statement the broad impact that increased access to smartphones, screens and social media is having on young people in terms of mental health, addiction and sleep deprivation. Digital technology and social media has provided an anonymous platform for unacceptable conduct that might not normally happen face-to-face. And obviously that's a problem for wider society and not just about young people. But that said, can the Cabinet Secretary say more about how the guidance will help schools support good, healthy behaviour online?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for her question. I think she raises a really important point. I'm sure colleagues in the Chamber will engage with teachers in their own constituency and parents and carers, and they will recognise some of the challenges Ms Maguire has outlined in relation to behaviour online. The guidance makes clear that unacceptable behaviour, whether that's online or not, is unacceptable. The playground, whether that be in the classroom or anywhere else, there is a limitation though to where schools can act in that regard, and that's why having really strong home link relationships is hugely important. It's also why the development of a behaviour action plan includes having those strong parental links. Having high expectations for respectful and responsible conduct should also be rooted within a school's existing positive relationships and behaviour policies. But more broadly, there is an issue and a challenge around about the use of social media and behaviour online. Schools are no different in that regard. But I think there is an opportunity through the refreshed guidance on acceptable behaviours, linking that to the curriculum, to consider further learning on the use of digital technologies and in relation to the internet. I know that's something schools are taking forward at the current time, and we will continue to support them in that development through the Behaviour Action Plan.
Thank you. That concludes the Ministerial Statement on mobile phones and behaviour and relationships in school. We move to decision time. There are no questions to be put as a result of today's business. That concludes decision time, and we will now move on to members' business. And I ask members who are leaving the chamber to do so quietly. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please, subscribe to and share our channel, or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.